In the autumn of 1963, the world was in full-on Beatlemania, and was only beginning to grasp the phenomenon. Just months earlier, the Beatles had stormed the British charts with their debut, Please Please Me, recorded quickly over a handful of sessions. Now, with their second album, they faced a new challenge, proving they were more than a fleeting sensation. This time, they were no longer pushed into rushed recordings. For their follow-up, the group had the luxury of returning to EMI Studios, later known as Abbey Road, over the course of several months. It was their first real chance to slow down in the studio, experiment with arrangements alongside producer George Martin, and capture the performances that revealed their growing confidence as musicians. They were four young men in the eye of a storm, caught between the chaos of fame and the thrill of success. And they would not only conquer Britain, they would soon conquer America and the world. Join us as we uncover the stories, the songs, and the people. This is the story of With the Beatles.
It was getting really big, I think we noticed as we tried to move around town. We started being noticed in the street.
One of the things I was grateful for was that we had a kind of staircase to climb.
First of all, it was making it big in Liverpool, and then being the best group in the county, then being the best group in England, and then we got to Scotland and break them in and things like that.
Then it was like, well, what's left? Well, radio. We wanted to be on the Saturday Morning Club. Brian Matthews did, which is a huge show. And the great thing I loved about the show was you'd wake up after your week of school or whatever it was, and you'd lie in. And I had a radio by my bed, and I'd lie in till about 11. Great, the most delicious lie-in ever of your life, those teenage lie-ins, Saturday. Lie-in, feeling great. Turn the radio on, and this program would be on there still for another hour, Saturday Club. So that we really wanted to be on that. We knew that there were people listening to that. It was a huge audience.
We did a lot of tracks that were never recorded on record for Saturday Club. A lot of stuff we'd been doing at the Cabin or Hamburg. And there's some good stuff in there. They were well recorded too.
You're talking about we got a song here from the very early days, which is From Me to You. I mean, was that written in the same sort of way that you describe? Sort of
yes.
What was the genesis of that song?
Yes, it would. In the early days, John and I would literally take our two guitars and sit wherever we were. I seem to remember a bit of this was done on a tour coach, in a hotel room, often on the twin beds, with John just sitting on one of them, me on the other, and we'd be the afternoon when we'd done our sound check or whatever. We looked at the hall, and we had from now till the evening. And rather than go to the flicks or something, we'd sit down and we'd think, let's write a song.
Yeah, we were writing it in a car, I think, and I think the first line was mine. I mean, I know it was mine. And then after that, we took it from there. It was far bluesier than that when we wrote it. The notes, if you could rearrange it pretty funky.
Again, From Me to You was a pop song.
We were just writing the next single. Yeah. But that was a combination written song. It was not a song, written individually. It was created together.
And we just trade off each other. And it was very magical because me being left-handed, I was like a mirror version of him. He could look at my guitar, I could look at his, and it was like looking in a mirror in many ways. It's quite strange, actually. But we could play off each other, and we knew each other so well, having come up in Liverpool together, started writing songs, having come through the whole Beatle thing together. And we could read each other, and we knew what each other was sort of going to think. Well, with From Me to You, we'd had a lot of these I love you, P.S. I love you, she loves you, please, please me. We'd put a lot of that in it. So this was going to get all the I's and me's all in one thing. From me to you, which is a little kind of formula we were using. The pivotal thing I think about it was when we got to the middle. We always called them the middle eights, by the way, even whether it was 16 bars or 32 or just 3. They were middle eights to us because we'd heard musicians saying it's the middle eight. And we didn't realise it was 8 bars. It just sounded like a great catchphrase to us. So when we reached the middle 8, it went to a different chord than one we'd used before. It was slightly more sophisticated. I remember being very pleased with the chord in the middle, which was different from what we'd been. It was anything that you want. Then he went, And I always remembered that moment in my own personal memory as being, wow, we're really developing now. We're moving away from the three-chord songs. There's something more sophisticated about this.
Probably the thing that John and I will do will be write songs as we have been doing as a sort of sideline now. We'll probably develop that a bit more, we hope.
You can be big-headed and say, yeah, we're going to last 10 years. But as soon as you've said that, you think, we're lucky if we last 3 months,
One of the amazing attributes that the Beatles possessed was their innate ability to interpret a song that they had a passion for, with the exuberance and flair in order to create a distinctively unique cover version. Arguably, this album displays the group's peak at these interpretations. You can tell from listening to these tracks, even many decades later, that they thoroughly enjoyed recording them, possibly even more than the original songs they recorded for this album. The Beatles had a special attachment to the music of the Miracles. Many influences have been cited by many authors as to which recording artists have contributed to the sound and style of the Beatles' music, but Smokey Robinson and the Miracles should definitely be at the top of that list during the latter half of 1963. A sizable amount of the band's original compositions appearing during this period were said, by John and Paul themselves, to have been inspired by Smokey Robinson, including This Boy, All I've Got to Do, and Not a Second Time. In retrospect, an event occurring during the recording of Lennon's Double Fantasy album in 1980 shed some light to the impact the Miracles' music had on the career of the Beatles. While recording the vocal track for the hit song Woman, Yoko commented that John sounded like a Beatle. "Actually, I'm supposed to be Smokey Robinson at the moment, my dear," John corrected her. William Smokey Robinson was born on February 19, 1940, in Detroit, Michigan. An uncle gave him the nickname Smokey Joe, later shortened to Smokey, at a young age because of his love for cowboy movies. As the lead vocalist for the Matadors, Smokey Robinson began touring local hotspots in Detroit and, in 1958, under their brand new name The Miracles, released records on End Records and Chess Records through his connection with his newfound friend, Berry Gordy. When Smokey suggested to Gordy the idea of forming his own record label, The Miracles were among the first acts signed to his Tamla label, which soon evolved into Motown Records. Smokey's close friendship with Berry Gordy led to his being appointed vice president of Motown Records in 1961, as well as working as a successful artist, producer, and songwriter for the label. The Miracles' single Shop Around became the first #1 single on the Billboard R&B charts for Motown, #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. The group's career with Smokey as lead singer-songwriter on Motown's Tamla label spanned 12 years and a total of 27 top 40 hits on the Billboard Hot 100, 6 of which reached the top 10, including Mickey's Monkey, I Second That Emotion, and Baby Baby Don't Cry. The Miracles' fourth top 40 pop hit was their self-penned classic, You've Really Got a Hold on Me, which was originally intended as a B-side to their single Happy Landing. Once focus was changed to the other side of the record, You've Really Got a Hold on Me reached #1 on the Billboard R&B singles chart and #8 on the Billboard Hot 100. This song was composed by Smokey in a hotel room in 1962, while in New York on business for Motown Records, his inspiration being Sam Cooke's hit Bring It On Home to Me, which he heard on the radio during this trip. The single was released in Britain on the Oriole label, but failed to make it in the UK charts, although it did get the attention of John Lennon, who loved it enough to scarf it up for the Beatles to work up a powerful rendition. Having probably been in the mood for recording cover versions, since they had just recorded 36 of them for broadcast on BBC Radio between the dates of July 2nd and 16th, 1963, the Beatles began proceedings for their second album on July 18th, 1963, by recording this recent John Lennon favorite. Incidentally, Please Please Me was still in the #1 position on the UK album charts, 4 months after its release, when the Beatles began recording their second album on this day. Running from 7 to 10:45 p.m., the session began with You've Really Got a Hold on Me, inadvertently changing the title from the original You've. 7 live takes of the song were first recorded, featuring all 4 Beatles playing their usual instruments and singing without overdubs, accompanied by producer George Martin on piano. Only 4 of these performances were complete, 3 of them being false starts, with take 7 being the keeper. The Beatles immediately recorded 4 edited pieces for the song, concentrating on the word baby appearing in the final verse on the ending riffs of the song. Take 10 finalized the ending riff, while take 11 perfected the word baby. This completed the recording of the finished version of the song as we know it. Completed by approximately 8 p.m., it took an estimated hour to fully record this amazing rendition of an amazing song. This is not to say that the Beatles were done with the song at this point. Being that they were finally granted the use of 4-track recording equipment on October 17, 1963, John insisted that they take another stab at the song on this date. Sound engineer Jeff Emmerich, in his book Here, There, and Everywhere, explains, perhaps in his naivete, John thought that simply recording it on 4-track instead of 2-track would somehow make it sound better, but after one whack at it, the idea was abandoned. George Martin at that point insisted that they move on, explaining that the recording they made on July 18, 1963 was adequate. John then exclaimed, "All right, George, we give up," and then added, "But you'd better come on down here and listen to our next #1 record," thus introducing their next single, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which was recorded next. Many sources rightfully claim the Beatles' version of You Really Got a Hold on Me as one of the best cover songs of their career. Many descriptive words have been used by these sources to solidify that claim. It can best be summed up by the words of Paul McCartney, as quoted in the anthology book. "A lot of our tracks may not have been cool. I think if we'd just been cool, we wouldn't have made it how we did. But that was a great aspect of us. John would do a shot of rhythm and blues, or You Really Got a Hold on Me. You could call that cool. Simply put, the song is just plain cool."
I was just interested in the music and how to do it. How can I do that? Which is what I was doing, studying the records. I studied the records. What are they saying? How are they doing it? How do they make this music? What is it that they're doing that excites me, that I want to do it? I was a rock and roll freak at art school, and I had a friend who was a blues freak. So he turned me on to blues. You know, and he was the same age as me, and he understood rock and roll. He knew what Elvis and Fats Domino and Little Richard were all about. But he said, "How about this? You know, have you heard, this is where that came from." And I thought, oh, that's where rock and roll. It didn't take my love from rock and roll away, and it also added blues to my consciousness, the real blues.
Yes. What were the practical ambitions of that child in Liverpool, dreaming away at the bus stop? I mean, what did you want to be?
It involved money.
Did it?
Yeah, because I was, raised mainly in a place called Speke, which was quite down at heel, and still is actually, because my mum was a midwife. So we'd always get moved to the frontiers of Liverpool, The roads were not built. But I saw, in looking around at my neighbours, that the problem was money, that they always argued why they fell apart, why their kids had to go away, or something. Money was the big central problem. So I didn't know what it was I wanted to do. I didn't really think it'd be music, but I knew it had to involve money, so that at least if I got married, at least that part would be taken out of the equation. And then I might have a good marriage if I was lucky, but I wanted to remove that evil money problem, that was going to wreck the marriage before you started.
So the lure of the music industry in those days for you then was what, fame and fortune, basically?
It was, absolutely.
It was exactly that.
And in fact, it's funny that it's changed. In fact, I'm not so sure it has, actually. I think we assume it's sort of changed. I think when we started, no doubt about it, it was to get out of having to do a job and commit ourselves to some sort of profession that was going to you'd be like a millstone round. We all felt that. We all felt we wanted to be in something sort of a little less job-like. And it was to get fame and fortune, yes.
John has always had a passion for money. This fact was no secret. There were many quotes from him saying that money was the big reason that he got into the music business. When the Beatles first arrived in America on February 7th, 1964, and they were asked at the press conference if they could sing something, John quipped, "No, we need money first." Even in his final years, John heard that Paul had built up a $25 million fortune and, being the competitor that he was, set off to do the same with the help of Yoko's business acumen. This song may not have been written by John, but no other composition could have been more suitable for the Beatles to include in their catalog, especially recognizing the fact that Lennon himself sang it. Unmistakably, John's love for music truly was the biggest force that ignited within him the desire for a career as a musician. But as he stated to the NME in '63, his professional ambition was to be rich and famous. Money really was what he wanted. Berry Gordy was born on November 28, 1929, in Detroit, Michigan. He first set his sights on becoming a professional boxer, which he did for a few years after dropping out of high school in his junior year. He was then drafted by the US Army and served in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. After his return, his love for music won out, and he began a career as a songwriter. After meeting Jackie Wilson at the Flame Show Bar Talent Club, Gordy got him to record 5 songs he had co-written, Lonely Teardrops being one of them, this becoming a top 10 pop hit in early 1959. Using his songwriting fortune, he shifted his focus to becoming a producer, establishing a sizable clientele of artists, including The Miracles. With an $800 loan from his family, Gordy founded his own R&B record label, Tamla Records, in January of 1959. A few months later, in April 1960, he incorporated Motown Record Corporation as the parent company. From then on, Motown became the umbrella under which Tamla and other labels, like Gordy, Soul, and VIP, operated. Tamla had regional success very quickly through their release of Marv Johnson's hit, Come to Me, which was picked up for national release by United Artists Records and hit number 30 on the Billboard Hot 100. Gordy collaborated with many songwriters, including the receptionist at his Hitsville, USA office, Jenny Bradford. Together they wrote Money, That's What I Want, in '59 and gave it to Jenny Bradford's high school friend and new recruit, Barrett Strong, to record on Berry Gordy's Tamla label. While Gordy was sitting at the piano writing a song, Janie Bradford walked in and inquired about it. One conversation led to another, and as he was complaining that he was in need of money, they both incorporated that conversation into the song he was writing. Barrett Strong then arrived at that time and asked him to move over and let him play the chords that Gordy had written, saying that he could play piano better. Gordy and Janie Bradford finished writing the song then and there as Barrett Strong rehearsed singing the new lyrics. Gordy was impressed enough by his impromptu performance that he promised Strong that he would allow him to sing and play the piano on the recording. After relocating his entire Motown company to Los Angeles, California, Gordy continued the success of the label well into the 80s, with artists including Rick James, Lionel Richie, Smokey Robinson, and Stevie Wonder. He eventually retired as a company mogul by selling the label to MCA and Boston Ventures in 1988 for $61 million. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1990. The first time the Beatles brought Money, That's What I Want, into the recording studio was for their Decca Records audition on January 1st, 1962. All of the 15 songs recorded on that day were done quickly in one take. With original drummer Pete Best playing primarily on the toms throughout the song, it plods along at a quicker pace than we're used to hearing and comes across somewhat rudimentary. The arrangement is polished due to the Beatles performing the song quite regularly in their stage act by this time, but they hadn't made it their own yet. They were simply performing their take on a Barrett Strong song. With Ringo now positioned as the new drummer, the Beatles brought Money into EMI Studio 2 on July 18, 1963. After recording You Really Got a Hold on Me, they immediately recorded the majority of Money, lowering the key from F on the original Barrett song, recording to E, which suited John's vocal range better. With George Martin on piano, the group performed the song live, vocals and all, for 6 full takes until everyone was satisfied, take 6 being the best. All instruments were recorded on one track of the 2-track tape, the other track consisting of only John's vocal. A piano edit piece by George Martin, probably for the song's introduction, immediately followed the final take, which brought this to take 7. Surprisingly, while the Beatles were on vacation, George Martin returned to EMI Studio 2 on September 30th, 1963, to perform additional piano parts for the song Money. He recorded 3 overdubbing attempts onto take 7 of the song, which thereby meant that the overdubs he recorded on July 30th, 1963, takes 8 through 14, were viewed as unsuitable. Even though mono mixes of some other tracks for the new album were completed on this day, Money was not one of them. This apparently meant that George Martin still didn't view the song as complete, even though the Beatles were through recording the song nearly 2.5 months earlier. October 29th, 1963 was the day that George Martin chose to do the stereo mixing for the entire With the Beatles album. He created these mixes in order to choose the album tracks to run, which means that, at least at this point if not earlier, he realized that the impact of Money would make a great album closer, exactly like Twist and Shout had done for the first album. The only problem was that the stereo mix made of the song on this day apparently didn't suit his fancy, since it was not used. Norman Smith and Jeff Emmerich were once again utilized as engineers on this day, as well as the mysterious BT. Finally, on the next day, George Martin decided that, in order to get a proper stereo mix of the song, 2 separate 2-track mono mixes would be utilized together. 1 mono mix for each channel. It was decided to proceed in this way in order to avoid any additional tape-to-tape copying, which decreases sound quality and increases tape hiss. This is the final released stereo mix of the song, which is significantly different from the mono mix made on August 21st, 1963, that predated the piano overdubs made on September 30th, 1963. The mixes differ in other ways as well, such as the mono mix including Ringo's taps in the song's intro. Another difference is, on the stereo mix, George Harrison's lead guitar part comes in quite forcefully just before the 3rd measure, whereas the mono mix fades his guitar part in on the 4th measure. And since Capitol Records in the US habitually made Type B mono mixes out of the stereo mixes by combining both of the stereo mixes together, American audiences became acquainted with only the stereo mix of the song at the time, even if they purchased the mono album. Lyrically speaking, you can almost see the smiles on Berry Gordy and Jenny Bradford's faces as they coupled these humorous lyrics with this addictive blues riff and chord pattern, dissolving the old cliche, the best things in life are free, with "you can keep them for the birds and bees." It's truly priceless, as well as following it up with the irreverent phrase, "I want money." The same goes for "your loving won't pay my bills," as we dispense with the thought that young lovers only need each other to get by. While not considered by many as a novelty or comedy song, it surely fits the bill in its stripped-down form. This, of course, is not the case when the Beatles growl at you with the intensity that they did. One of the many skills that the Beatles possessed was their ability to choose the best material to add to their repertoire. This Motown classic was taken by the group and turned into a pure rocker. Another example of the group taking over ownership of the song because of their interpretation. The album With the Beatles has been considered by many to contain the best Beatles cover songs of their recorded career. Evidenced by this performance alone, that claim truly becomes undisputed.
We were the first working class singers that stayed working class and pronounced it. Didn't try and change our accents, which in England were looked down upon, probably still are.
And it was great, we were kings and we all, just at the prime, and we all used to just go around London in our cars and meet each other and talk about music with the Animals and Eric and all that.
And the other great deal was every time it moved in the charts, we'd have a celebratory dinner. So you notice, if you look at the Beatles, from when they started, in the first 18 months, they went, blumped right up, because we were eating all this food. That's where I discovered smoked salmon. Never had any salmon that didn't come out of a tin till I was 22.
I remember sitting on a pair of twin beds in a hotel bedroom. Had a day off, so we were going to write song. All our early songs had always had, please, please, me, from me to you, P.S. I love you. We always had this very personal thing, thank you, girl. And we hit on the idea of doing a kind of reported conversation. I saw her yesterday, she told me what to say, she said she loves you. So it just gave us another little dimension, really. It just meant that the song then was something different from what we and other people had written before.
Well, She Loves You was written somewhere on the way to Newcastle, and finally, I think it was Newcastle, and finally, it was written together, and I don't know how. I remember it was Paul's idea to, or was that from me to you, where instead of singing about I love you, that we'd have a third party passing a message on to somebody else. And that kind of little details is apparent in his work now, right? You know, and is apparent in the Beatles and now, where he will write a story, and I'm more inclined to just write about myself.
Was that the first one with the kind of the screams stuff in it?
Yeah.
Is that the first? Yeah.
Yeah, the woo was taken from the Isley Brothers, Twist and Shout.
Yeah.
Which we stuck in everything, from me to you, she loves you. They all had that woo.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Because it became a big rock and roll group.
Yeah, but there'd been lots of oh yeah and apparent in rock and roll. You know, I remember hearing it's not Don't Be Cruel, it's that other one of Presley's that has the same kind of feeling. Goes yeah. Right? And Lonnie Donegan always did yeah, who was an English, Irish, Scot, Englishman, Britisher, who'd done a lot of American folk music. And he used yeah a lot. And I remember thinking when Elvis did that one, all shook up, it was, we've got oh yeah and yay all in the same song. I thought that was the first time I'd heard them all together. But I can't remember how we got the yeah for She Loves You.
Because there were a lot of record companies in America, lots of records seemed to only be distributed on a local basis. However, many of the small companies were affiliated with major labels that had distribution in the UK. So some obscure American records ended up being sold in the UK, but were unknown in America. This explanation by George Harrison sheds a lot of light on how an obscure song like Devil in Her Heart ended up on a million-selling British and American album. This song was originally titled Devil in His Heart, and was recorded by a young girl group out of Hamtramck, Michigan, called the Donnays. This record, which was the only one recorded by the group, was released on the local Detroit label Correct Tone Records in mid-62. This small record company, as George referred to it, had an affiliation with a larger label from New York City, Brent Records, who picked up the record for national distribution. Although its B-side, Bad Boy, received substantial airplay in the Michigan area, the single missed the US charts. The single did get picked up by the UK label Oriole Records and was released there, but it didn't chart in Britain either. The Donnays were originally a 5-piece singing group who were school friends. Its members were Janice Gwynn, her sister Army Gwynn, Yvonne Symington, Michelle Ray, and Mary, last name unknown. We were discovered at a high school talent show, Hamtramck High, remembers Janice Gwynn. The song was Please Mr. Postman, she relates about their talent show offering. After they acquired a manager, they were then booked as local performers, one notable show being at the 20 Grand Club in Detroit, Michigan. According to our managers, after this performance, Berry Gordy was interested in signing us up with Motown. However, they decided to go with Correct Tone Studios. Richard Drapkin, the composer of Devil in His Heart, was a songwriter and recording artist hailing from the Detroit area. He worked with one of the famous up-and-coming labels from that locality. Drapkin's professional songwriting career spans from the time of Devil in His Heart through till the mid-70s. His songs were covered by R&B soul artists such as Eddie Kendricks, That's All Behind You, The Spinners, Together We Can Make Such Sweet Music, Larry Santos, Now That I Have Found You, Spanky Wilson, I Think I'm Gonna Cry, and Barbara Lewis, That's the Way I Like It. Although the record did not chart in America, Oriole Records in Britain picked up a single for release overseas. If it weren't for Brian Epstein buying a copy of the single for his Nems record store in Liverpool, England, the Beatles wouldn't have stumbled upon Devil in His Heart and liked it enough to work up a rendition of the song, thereby making it the most successful composition in the Richard Drapkin songwriting catalog. Unfortunately, we never received any royalties for the song that was released on the Beatles album, Janice Gwynn remembers. We didn't even know they recorded the song until one morning my sister Army and I were watching the Beatles cartoons on television and heard our song, Devil in Her Heart. Boy, we were shocked! While Devil in His Heart by the Donnays may never have been a hit anywhere, it has been a sought-after record for decades because of the Beatles' version. Having just recorded the song for the BBC and having it fresh in their minds, the Beatles thought it would be an excellent contender for possible inclusion on their second album, as they entered EMI Studios 2 days later, on July 18, 1963. 3 live takes are made of the complete song, with all 4 group members playing their usual instruments, with all lead and background singing. Take 3 was deemed the best. The structure of this song is a unique one for the Beatles up to this point. We see here a back and forth pattern between a refrain and a verse. Each refrain and verse contains subtle changes in lyrics, so there is not a constant, unchangeable bridge or chorus as we're all used to hearing in the Beatles' early catalog. What we end up with in this case is a refrain, verse, refrain, verse, refrain, verse, refrain structure, or A, B, A, B, A, B, A, the final refrain being extended for an appropriate conclusion. George gets the nod as the true highlight of the recording, with his Latin guitar phrasings and suitable lead vocal work. Ringo also impresses with his Latin-sounding bam boom boom drum fills that introduce the song as well as each refrain. His drum style throughout has a rumba rhythm which, with the maraca overdub, creates a convincing Latin feel. His open hi-hat sound, common with the early Beatles songs, gives the song a fullness and a drive that is lacking on the original version. Also noteworthy are the background vocals of John and Paul, which emphasize an effective nagging quality that is appropriate to the lyrics of the song. Although the rhythm guitar and bass are rudimentary throughout, Lennon and McCartney provide these essential ingredients to create a full picture and round out an impressive cover version of an obscure song.
I do remember, however, one moment, and we were going up the motorway and the windscreen got knocked out by a pebble. So Mal just put his hat on backwards, punched the windscreen out completely and drove, but of course this was winter in Britain and it was freezing, and because it was fog he was having to look for the curb all the time, all the way up to Liverpool. It's 200 mile. So we were very, very cold, and I remember what we did was we lay on each other
with a bottle of whiskey, and then when the one on the top got so cold he was hypothermia was setting in. It was his turn to get on the bottom, and then, we'd warm each other up that way and keep swigging the whiskey.
It was quite an image, if, you'd think, people think stardom and it's glamorous, There's us freezing, lying literally on top of each other.
Oh yeah, we were tight. That was one thing to be said about us. We were really tight, as friends. And that was a good thing about being 4 together, not like Elvis, I always felt sorry later for Elvis because he was on his own. He had his guys with him, but there was only one Elvis. Nobody else knew what he felt like. But for us, we all shared the experience.
The Beatles. The Beatles. No, he couldn't catch on. Here, Burn, is the tea ready yet? Yes!
The significance of Till There Was You in the Beatles recorded canon may appear to be small to most Beatles fans. The truth of the matter is, though, that this very song was a major determining factor in the Beatles being signed to EMI's Parlophone Records in Britain, thereby catapulting them to fame throughout the world. If it wasn't for the Beatles adding Till There Was You to their repertoire, they no doubt would have had the same fate as most of the beat groups of the Liverpool music scene, such as Cass and the Casanovas, Derry and the Seniors, and Rory, Storm and the Hurricanes. On February 13, 1962, Brian Epstein met with George Martin, who was the head of A&R at EMI's Parlophone Records. Martin, who was looking for the next pop idol to be secured to his small label, eagerly listened to the recording of their Decca audition. Although not overly impressed, Till There Was You stuck out like a sore thumb. He was impressed by George Harrison's guitar work, as well as Paul's vocals, which earmarked Paul as a possible lead singer of the group in Martin's mind. He concluded that it might be worth his while giving the Beatles a proper audition for EMI, which was eventually slated for June 6, 1962. As it turned out, it was the inclusion of the soft ballad Till There Was You that got them the audition with EMI, which led to them being signed up to the Parlophone label. This event, in turn, gave them the chance to show what they could do as performers and songwriters, which, shortly thereafter, made the group a household name around the world. The song Till There Was You was written by playwright, songwriter, and conductor Meredith Willson, and first recorded in 1950 by Eileen Wilson under the title Till I Met You, before he revised it for his Broadway hit The Music Man in 1957. The show's cast album, featuring Barbara Cook, won the first Grammy for the Best Original Cast Album, and Shirley Jones later sang the song in the 1962 film adaptation. But the version that really caught Paul's ear was Peggy Lee's 1961 recording on her album, Latin a la Lee. Paul later remembered, "I didn't know that it was from the musical The Music Man until many years later. This led me to songs like A Taste of Honey, and things that were slightly to the left and the right of rock and roll. I could never see the difference between a beautiful melody and a cool rock and roll song. I learned to love all the ballady stuff through my dad and relatives. Till There Was You, My Funny Valentine, I thought these were good tunes. The fact that we weren't ashamed of those leanings meant that the band could be a bit more varied. And there was a need for that because we played cabaret a lot. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting collaboration was forming during that period. We went on from Love Me Do to writing deeper, much more intense things. So it was just as well someone didn't come up and tell us how uncool Till There Was You was." Peggy Lee's version, with its jazz-styled lead guitar, became the basis for the Beatles adaptation. Paul skillfully rearranged the song to suit their four-piece guitar, bass, drums lineup, and perfected the song respectfully with its Broadway-esque sentimentality in the most confident way that he could. Peggy Lee continued to have an admirer in Paul, who wrote and produced the title track of her 1974 album, Let's Love. The Beatles first brought the song to Studio 2 on July 18, 1963. Around 10 p.m., they ran through 3 takes, 2 of them complete before deciding to revisit it on another day. The instrumentation mirrored their Decca audition from a year and a half earlier, with Ringo now on the drum kit. On July 30th, likely at George Martin's suggestion, the drums were deemed too prominent for the ballad, and Ringo switched to a pair of bongos from EMI's collection. The arrangement was also simplified from the Decca version, featuring only one guitar solo and eliminating the need for the repeated bridge and final verse. Take 8 was judged the best, a full band live performance that required no overdubs. The lyrics, although perfectly suited to The Music Man as well as to the time period, come across as particularly schmaltzy within the Beatles' catalog. The sentimentality conveyed here with lines such as "wonderful roses" and "fragrant meadows of dawn and dew" sounds dated compared to the youth-orientated "yeah, yeah, yeahs" most Beatles fans were hearing at this time. Keeping in mind the purpose of the inclusion of this song in their repertoire, the Beatles overlooked the old-fashioned lyrics in order to show their versatility, as well as to impress an older generation. Not to say that the Beatles couldn't poke a little fun at the extreme schmaltz of the lyrics, evident in the overpronunciation of the C in the word music on their Decca version of the song, as well as the Americanized pronunciation of the word saw as sawr in the released version. Paul continued this ruse during 1963, as later evidenced in the Royal Variety performance in November, but relented to the seriousness of their American premiere on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 to sing it straight. The song's lyrics express the simple sentiment of not having been able to enjoy the beauty of life, such as bells ringing and birds winging, until the singer met his or her true love. As the bridge testifies, music was then realized for the first time, as well as finally noticing love all around the singer that was never noticed till there was you. Hardly the example of storytelling that appeared in popular songwriting of the mid-60s, but a prime example of what a perfectly suited set of lyrics can convey with a suitable melody to accompany it. It definitely tugs at the heartstrings in its context of The Music Man. Perhaps Till There Was You was best described by William Mann in his essay printed in the London Times in December 23, 1963, saying, "How fresh and euphonious the ordinary guitars sound in the Beatles' rendition of Till There Was You." He then describes their performance of this song as a cool, easy, tasteful version of this ballad, quite without artificial sentimentality. The songwriting is perfect, and the Beatles' performance is flawless. Enough said. The Beatles took great pride in their recordings, whether they were newly written originals or well-loved cover versions. When the band entered EMI Studios for recording sessions in the early years, regardless of what they were recording and no matter how rushed their schedules were, they were on top of their game. As can be seen by the cover songs chosen for their second album with the Beatles, they were given more leeway to record what they felt strongly about, as opposed to having George Martin or Brian Epstein suggest the track list for them. The songs that the group chose to record usually weren't big hits. In fact, some were so obscure that many Beatles fans assumed they had written them. Please Mr. Postman was the exception. The fifth and final girl group song the Beatles picked to record professionally was also the biggest hit they chose. The original version of the song by the Motown group The Marvelettes peaked at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts in December of 1961, as well as a number 1 position on the R&B chart. It was actually the first number 1 hit the Motown label ever had. A quite interesting mystery surrounding Please Mr. Postman is the actual identity of the songwriter and songwriters. You might think that taking a look at the label on the original record would solve this issue, but it's simply not the case. On the Marvelettes record, you'll see the songwriting credit is Dobbins, Garrett, Bryan-Burt, but the songwriting credit on the label of the Beatles version simply states Holland as the songwriter. The Songwriters Hall of Fame credits the song to Holland, Bateman, Gorman, while the Beatles' discography book, All Together Now, even includes Motown founder Berry Gordy as co-author. To solve the mystery, we need to look at the history of this song. The Marvels were a female singing group from Inkster, Michigan, made up of 5 high school friends: Georgia Dobbins, Georgiana Tillman, Gladys Horton, Juanita Cowart, and Katherine Anderson. In December of '61, they landed an audition with Berry Gordy and Smokey Robinson at Hitsville, USA, home of the Motown Record Corporation, along with their Tamla record label. Although they performed well, they were required to come back with their own original song. Georgia Dobbins took it upon herself to take a blues song written by a friend of hers named William Garrett and rework it for the group to perform at a later audition for Motown. William Garrett only had a small set of lyrics, but no melody for a song he titled Please Mr. Postman. And when Georgia Dobbins asked permission to rewrite it to be suitable for a girl group to sing, he agreed with the condition that he would get a credit as a writer. Georgia Dobbins, keeping only the song's title, turned the song into a plea for a letter from a boyfriend. With this new song, they passed the second audition, but not until their name was changed from the plain-sounding, according to the opinion of Berry Gordy, Marvels to the Marvelettes. He also felt the song needed some sprucing up, so he hired the songwriting team of Brian Holland and Robert Bateman, collectively known as Bryan-Burt, to rework it even more. Brian Holland also had a songwriting partner named Freddie Gorman, an actual Detroit postman, who was enlisted for the final touches on the song. When the Marvelettes turned up at the recording studio to record Please Mr. Postman, which was produced by Brian Burt, aka Brian Holland and Robert Bateman, principal songwriter and vocalist Georgia Dobbins was not present. Influenced by her father, who didn't want his daughter singing in nightclubs, she left the group and was replaced by Wanda Young. Although Gladys Horton did end up singing lead on Please Mr. Postman, Georgia Dobbins was thankfully still credited as co-author of the song, which spent a week at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, as well as the R&B charts, in December of 1961. Therefore, you could credit Please Mr. Postman to Dobbins, Garrett, Holland, Bateman, Gorman, with Dobbins as primary songwriter who transformed Garrett's original lyrics into the version that became a Motown hit. The Beatles became familiar with Please Mr. Postman undoubtedly because of its UK release by the Marvelettes back in November of 1961 on the Fontana label. George Harrison relates in the Beatles anthology book, Brian Epstein had a policy at NEM's record store of buying at least one copy of every record that was released. Consequently, we had records that weren't hits in Britain and weren't even hits in America. Before we were going to a gig, we'd meet in the record store after it shut, and we'd search the racks like ferrets to see what the new ones were there. Records we thought were interesting. Before their official rendition was recorded at EMI Studios, however, manager Brian Epstein needed to strike a monetary deal with Berry Gordy, president of Motown Records in Detroit. Recognizing that the industry standard during that time was 2 cents per record sold, Brian Epstein offered 1.5 cents, figuring that the amount of income generated from Beatles sales in the UK alone, not to mention likely future American income, would be sufficient. Berry Gordy initially refused, agreeing only 2 minutes before the offer was due to expire. This agreement allowed Please Mr. Postman, as well as Money, That's What I Want, and You Really Got a Hold on Me, to be included on the Beatles' second album. It has been stated by some authors that when the Beatles' cover versions outshone the originals, it's usually because of John. While his vocal delivery on both Twist and Shout and Money, That's What I Want definitely come to mind, Please Mr. Postman fits into this category as well. Jonathan Gold, in his book Can't Buy Me Love, The Beatles, Britain and America, states that John's vocal overpowers the lyrics, while the band's backing explodes off the record, thus epitomizing all that is the best about the Beatles' second album. Gladys Horton's charming vocal delivery for the Marvelettes' original version suited it very nicely, but the Beatles tightened up the harmonies and performed the song with such confidence that it almost makes the original sound like an imitation.
But in the early days, we were really set on giving people their money's worth off the record. And that was our policy first, just to put 14 tracks aside that was brand new. I never put singles on the albums, which everybody did was have a hit single and make an album around it.
With the Beatles was the first kind of put together album of first songbook, so to speak. And they gave me a list of their songs, and they were all thinking in terms of singles still. We weren't thinking in terms of an album being, a piece of an entity by itself. It was a collection of songs.
Usually the better songs, whether they were written together inspirationally, like She Loves You and From Me to You, or separately, like All My Lovin', were inspired songs. Mm-hmm. So they came from elsewhere and were delivered to us. And the ones we tried to write something usually didn't work, usually ended up on B-sides or records. Sure. And they sound like it.
Won't Be Long.
Won't Be Long was my attempt at writing another single. I never quite made it though. It Won't Be Long was the one where the guy in the Times London wrote about the Aeolian cadences of the chords at the end, which started the whole intellectual bit about Beatles. But I still don't hear any Aeolian cadences because I don't know what they are. Sound like exotic birds.
The pressure of songwriting can be tremendous when your aim is to extend a successful career. The list of one-hit wonders of the 50s and 60s is extensive, and this trend is multiplied to monumental proportions as time has passed. Having a big hit on the charts is a thrill, and is, for most artists, a once-in-a-lifetime experience. The trick is to perpetuate a reputation as musicians or songwriters, so that your latest release will be accepted with open arms even before it's heard. To reach that state, though, you need to prove yourself. Within a year's time, the Beatles had already proven themselves. They achieved their first British #1 with their second single, Please Please Me, in February of 1963. They followed this up with From Me to You, which shot to #1 in Britain for an amazing 7 weeks throughout May and June of '63. Then came the infectious pop anthem She Loves You, which also reached #1 and broke all sales records in Britain by selling 1.3 million copies. It was becoming quite apparent to the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team that having to continually top their last success was a daunting task. The pressure was indeed on. In July of '63, shortly after the song She Loves You was recorded, John's wheels were turning as to what would be the follow-up single. He came up with the chorus of a new song that utilized the repeating of the word yeah, just as She Loves You had done, figuring that their fans would latch on to that gimmick once that fourth British single was released. His sixth sense was correct, as the phrase yeah 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 became the catchword phrase in the autumn of that year. Contained in the chorus of this new song was wordplay that both Lennon and McCartney liked to throw into their lyrics to make things interesting. The song Please Please Me contained the double use of the word please, using it as a request and then an action. In this case, John used the phrase belong, specifying an amount of time, with belong, as in ownership. In his 1997 book, Many Years From Now, Paul explained this interest in wordplay. I was doing literature at school, so I was interested in plays on words and onomatopoeia. John didn't do literature, but he was quite well read, so he was interested in that kind of thing. We both liked to try and get a bit of double meaning in, so that was the high spot of writing that particular song. We'd spot the double meaning. I think everyone did, by the way. It was not just the genius of us. The occurrence of lyrical double meanings can be spotted throughout the Lennon-McCartney catalog. In the song You Won't See Me, that phrase meant that his girlfriend was too busy to give him any attention, but in the second verse it meant that he would turn away, as she literally wouldn't be able to see him. In Good Morning, a more subtle play on words can be spotted in the similar sounding words of the verse, Somebody needs to know the time, glad that I'm here. These little tricks became a habit and created a fun exercise for Beatles fans to discover. As history would have it, It Won't Be Long did not become the Beatles' next single release, nor was it released as a single at all in Britain or America. It never really made it, John said, concerning the song not being their next British single. Emphasis was made on writing a song for their next single that would appeal particularly to American audiences. When Lennon and McCartney tried again, they came up with I Want to Hold Your Hand, which, as history shows, made the grade. That is not to say that It Won't Be Long was viewed as a disappointment, because their producer George Martin was always looking for a potboiler to start off a new Beatles album, and this excellent song fit the bill for With the Beatles, their second album. It Won't Be Long was recorded on July 30th, 1963, during 2 sessions at EMI Studio 2. After an initial attempt of 10 takes in the morning was abandoned, the group began again in the evening, completing takes 11 to 17, with take 17 being chosen as the best one up to the second verse. For the remainder of the song, they recorded 6 further takes, 18 to 23, choosing take 21. These 2 halves were transferred to another machine so John could double-track his vocals before being edited together later. The edit was completed on August 21st, 1963, when George Martin, Norman Smith, and Jeff Emerick spliced takes 17 and 21 to form the master version, used for the official mono and stereo mixes. The structure of It Won't Be Long is somewhat unusual. The use of a chorus in Lennon-McCartney compositions came to the fore a little later and became a common feature of their songwriting formula as time progressed. Here, though, we have the first time an actual chorus appears in a Lennon-McCartney song. The structure consists of a chorus, 3 verses, and a bridge that is repeated twice. The finished song structure is a confusing chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, which would result in an A-B-A-C-B-A-C-B-A structure.
Hi, Beatles Bible. I'm Fathom, and today we're going to have a chat about It Won't Be Long, which is one of my favorite songs on With the Beatles. There are many things to love about this song, but I'm just going to highlight a few today. This is a track that I play in my Beatles cover band, despite doing tracks like A Day in the Life. This was actually one of the hardest for us to pick up because while the song is simple on the surface, on closer study it reveals itself to be quite a complex song. Besides being a bit of a trick of the mind, getting the call and response right rhythmically between the lead singer and the backing singers, it's also harmonically really interesting and quite sophisticated for a bubblegum pop band. Actually, let me grab a guitar. Oh, not that one. This one. The root chord of the song, the home chord, is E major. That is not where the song starts. It's not where the chorus starts. That starts here. It won't be long, yeah. It won't be long, yeah. So we only return to the home chord, to that root chord, after we've had this establishing shot. I know that's a cinematography term, but I think the vibe applies. So our home chord is actually the second chord that we hear in the song, not the first. They do this a couple of times on With the Beatles, actually. A similar thing is done with All My Lovin', which, again, is, I think, in E, but it starts here. Close your eyes and I'll kiss you, tomorrow I'll miss you. So we don't actually get to that root chord until we're 3 chords into the song. Just slightly atypical. Going back to It Won't Be Long, when we get to the verse, that does start on the root chord, but it moves from that E major to C. An unusual choice. That's quite harmonically sophisticated. And then it bounces back to the E. Starts here, drops down to here. Oh, Phantom of the Opera, back to here. And that up, down, up, I think, mirrors what's happening with the call and response of the chorus. It has this bounding, bouncing effect. It's very similar to yeah, 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 yeah. When we get to our bridge, there's a chromatic descent. Since you left me, I'm so alone. Musically interesting, but it's also something that the Beatles used quite a lot. Listen. Do you want to know a secret? It's that. Where it drops down in half steps. So they're doing the same thing here. Since you left me, I'm so alone. They would go on to use it in other songs as well. The bridge of And Your Bird Can Sing. When your prized possessions start to weigh you down. Or While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I look at you all, see the love there that's sleeping. We're not here to talk about any of those songs. All of this to say that that chromatic descent is harmonically a favorite of the Beatles and something that they will revisit later in their career as a band. They will also revisit it at the end of this song. And here is where I think the arrangement choices of the Beatles can be quite clever. Introducing a motif and then revisiting it at different points throughout the song. When it comes back, it feels like a callback. It's already familiar to us because we've heard it before. So a similar thing happens when we get to the end of the song. Till I belong to you. And we land on that slightly discordant note. That's our major 7th. Gives the song an element of class. Again, sophistication. That is a jazzy chord. They did a similar thing on She Loves You. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. It just bumps up the caliber of the chord, I'll say. I know it's a bit of a snobby take, but I'm sticking with it. Elevates the song. Because they could have ended with, it won't be long, yeah, yeah, till I belong to you. Which is just a reiteration of the end of the chorus as it stands in the rest of the song. They made a specific arrangement choice to create something new that draws on something that has already been established in the song. Very clever. Well done. A+. Another thing that I really love about the song is that stylistically it has a very interesting lineage. It can be quite a lot of fun to trace. So let's go on that journey. The chorus of the song has a call and response structure. John sings, yeah, yeah. That's our call. Paul and George sing, yeah, yeah. That's our response. Yeah, 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 yeah. Call and response is something that is very common to a lot of African musical traditions. It was brought by way of the transatlantic slave trade to the so-called New World, where it became the foundation for a number of nascent genres of music that would become rumbas in Cuba and the Dominican merengue and bachata, or the Trinidadian calypso, the Jamaican ska, and critically for this conversation, gospel and R&B in the United States. That music, gospel and R&B 45s, singles, traveled across the Atlantic, brought by sailors, to the United Kingdom, specifically to the port city of Liverpool, where it fell into the hands of eager young teenagers, music enthusiasts, popular music enthusiasts. Four such enthusiasts were John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Richard Starkey, and that became the basis for the musical education.
You know you make me wanna kick my heels up and...
Such that when John and Paul started writing their own songs, it was woven through with this very, very old African musical tradition, call and response. And that is how we arrive at It Won't Be Long. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's it for me. Back to you.
All in all, it can be stated that the arrangement of It Won't Be Long grabs the attention of the listener and packs the song with non-stop guts and drive. Their intended philosophy on these early sessions was to pack in as many changes and surprises as possible, especially when the song was slated to be their next single. This never-a-dull-moment atmosphere permeates It Won't Be Long, leaving no doubt as to their intent for the song. That's when we discovered double tracking, Lennon later stated. When I discovered it, I double-tracked everything. I wouldn't let him have anything single-tracked from then on. Although this was an exaggeration, listeners can't help but notice how prominent double-tracking of vocals and guitar leads were to become throughout the next couple of years. An interesting side note is the obvious influence of Arthur Alexander, which can easily be detected in John's singing style for this song. The line, "You Won't Leave Me No Mo'," which is also heard in the Beatles' rendition of Arthur Alexander's Anna on their first album, is a direct result of a flattering imitation of one of John's favorite singers of that time. It was becoming apparent with the first two album releases that John was asserting himself as the more predominant lead singer of the group. This trend would only increase as the following four album releases of 1964 would show. Whether as a lead singer or as a songwriter, John was determined to make his mark as the undisputed and natural leader of the group. Even the other members of the Beatles would testify at this time that John was their leader. When I hear rock, good rock of the caliber of Chuck Berry, I just fall apart, and I have no other interest in life. The world could be ending if rock and roll is playing. It's a disease of mine. In the 50s, when people were virtually singing about nothing, Chuck Berry was writing social comment songs with incredible meter to the lyrics. This 1972 quote from John, as recounted in the Beatles anthology book, summarizes the phenomenal influence Chuck Berry has had on the Beatles as well as in musical history. Chuck Berry was born Charles Edward Anderson Berry in St. Louis, Missouri, on October 18, 1926. The third of 6 children, Chuck had a love for many styles of music early in life, but especially acquired an interest in blues music, which he played since his teenage years. He was deeply influenced by the blues legend T-Bone Walker, from whom he copied his guitar riffs and stage style. In 1953, Chuck performed with the Johnny Johnson Trio, a club band from East St. Louis, Illinois. Their partnership continued through most of Johnny Johnson's successful career as a pianist and songwriter. Chuck liked to incorporate his intense love for country music into his performances with this group, which ended up attracting a following even among largely black audiences. This combination of country and blues music began the formation of the rock and roll sound, which is a similar evolution to what Elvis presented in combining his country roots with black music at approximately the same time. This achievement defines Chuck Berry as one of the pioneers of rock and roll music. As stated on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame website, while no individual can be said to have invented rock and roll, Chuck Berry comes the closest of any single figure to being the one who put all the essential pieces together. In 1955, Berry met blues legend Muddy Waters in Chicago, Illinois, who suggested he get in touch with Leonard Chess of Chess Records, who immediately signed him to a record contract that year. His first release was based on the country classic Ida Red, which Chuck decided to rechristen as Maybelline, becoming his first smash hit. It sold over 1 million copies and reached number 1 on the Billboard Rhythm and Blues chart, as well as crossing over to the pop chart, reaching number 5. Because rock and roll was in its infancy at this time, and because Chuck Berry was a black artist, his primary placements were on the rhythm and blues charts, and remained this way throughout his charting career of the 50s and 60s. After 3 more top 10 placements in the rhythm and blues charts, he once again crossed over into the pop charts with Roll Over Beethoven in 1956, reaching number 29, once again with Johnny Johnson on piano. According to biographer Bruce Pegg in his book, Brown-Eyed Handsome Man, the song was inspired in part by the rivalry between his sister Lucy's classical music training and Chuck's own self-taught, rough and ready music preference. Lucy regularly monopolized the family piano for playing classical music, while Chuck Berry wanted to play popular music. The Beatles' recording of Roll Over Beethoven occurred on July 30th, 1963. It took 5 takes of the full group, vocals and all, to perfect the song, take 5 being considered the best. Then, while re-recording the 2-track tape of Take 5 onto another 2-track machine, they simultaneously overdubbed 2 attempts of George double-tracking his vocals, while the other Beatles added hand claps throughout the song. The second attempt at this overdub, Take 7, was deemed the best. It appears that an undocumented overdub of George playing the guitar solo in the middle of the song was made, the result being panned more to the right channel in all of the stereo mixes that have been made to date. Also, the closing guitar chord was then recorded by George, this being labeled as Take 8. The intention being to edit this onto the complete Take 7 at a later date. By 8 p.m., the song was finished. Like most other Chuck Berry songs, Roll Over Beethoven comprises a standard 12-bar blues pattern, this being repeated 9 times. The first and fifth verses both fully consist of guitar solos, while the other 7 are all full vocal verses. As to song structure, the Beatles version is virtually a carbon copy of the original Chuck Berry version, right down to the guitar solos. As to style, the Beatles change it dramatically by lowering the key to D major, slowing it down somewhat, and playing it in a boogie-woogie style similar to later Chuck Berry classics like Johnny Be Good and Carol. George's vocal delivery varies from the original as well, singing it in a more in-the-pocket fashion, like Johnny Be Good, instead of the looser rhythm sung by Berry himself on the original. Performance-wise, George shines the brightest, with his most competent guitar and vocal delivery to date. Ringo would come next with his exuberant drilling drum work, complete with his characteristic offbeat drum fills. It was a song I liked. I had the Chuck Berry record, and I used to sing it at the clubs. While this statement from George is true, it wasn't always the case. The Beatles had been performing the song in their stage act as far back as 1957 when they were called the Quarrymen. But John had been the song's lead singer at the beginning. George had taken over singing lead on the song in 1961, and from that point made the song his own. In fact, the Beatles were so enamored with Chuck Berry that between the years 1957 and 1966, the Beatles performed more songs written by him than any other artist. 15, in fact.
Oh, my loving. So I was on a tour bus somewhere in the UK with nothing to do, and I started to think of these words, close your eyes. Although we'd met at this point, I don't know that I was thinking specifically of Jane Asher when I wrote this. Though we were courting, it's probably more a reflection on what our lives were like then. Leaving behind family and friends to go on tour and experience all these new adventures.
Nobody ever made it in America, and we were dying to be the first. This statement by John in September of 1964 puts in a nutshell how the Beatles felt about conquering the United States. They had truly taken over Britain and had made inroads in numerous other countries by 1963, but the US was their ultimate goal. They knew, though, that no foreign act had ever made more than a fleeting impact in the States. Regarding the American charts, John continued, "You get the odd hit from Britain, or you get the odd hit from Germany, there's a lot of freak records." They knew that to be able to have 4 straight #1 hits in America, as they had in Britain in 1963, would be a daunting task indeed. Actually, no foreign act had ever achieved this. If only they could get US exposure like they were having at home. In Britain, She Loves You sold an unprecedented 1.3 million copies, and I Want to Hold Your Hand sold 1.25 million. BBC radio programs, as well as national television broadcasts, brought the Beatles' faces and music into the homes of millions. Would they be able to penetrate the American market in the same way? And if they did, would they just end up a freak one-hit wonder like other British artists before them, such as Mr. Acker Blick, Stranger on the Shore, or The Tornadoes, Telstar? Manager Brian Epstein said the groundwork that allowed for the unthinkable to happen. As well as finally convincing Capitol Records to release the Beatles records in the US, he also struck a deal to have his clients appear on the highly influential American variety show, The Ed Sullivan Show. This show, which officially broke Elvis into the mainstream in October of '56, had the potential for mass exposure to its millions of weekly viewers. Reaching over 1 million sales with their singles in Britain was nothing compared to what The Ed Sullivan Show could do. As history testifies, on February 9, 1964, an estimated 73 million viewers watched this much-hyped young Liverpool group perform 5 songs live from CBS TV Studio 50 in New York City. The final 2 songs that they performed on that day were both sides of their current American #1 hit, I Want to Hold Your Hand. But they needed to decide on a song to put in the start-off position that would make the best first impression. This was a make-or-break decision, because the 73 million curiosity seekers could very well have chosen to turn the channel if they weren't impressed. Whether by plan or sheer luck, they chose to start off their set, as well as the whole show, with the very strong McCartney number, All My Loving. And, as George later said, while the show was on, there were no reported crimes, or very few. When the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, even the criminals had to rest for 10 minutes. Paul explains in his book The Lyrics, "We were on a package tour with probably 5 or 6 other bands, because one act was not enough to sell tickets," Paul continues. "I'd started work on the lyrics on the bus, and back then we were playing what was known as the Moss Empires circuit. The Moss Empires company owned a number of venues across the country, which would be some of the stops on the tour. There were these large, gorgeous, turn-of-the-century music halls, but nowadays most of them are bingo halls. These places are really nice, big, empty backstage areas. We arrived at the venue with all the hustle and bustle around me, all these various bands and tour crews and stagehand running about. I made my way to a piano and somehow found the chords." In his book Many Years From Now, Paul adds, "I didn't have a guitar, it was probably with our road manager, and I remember working the tune out to it on the piano. It was a good show song, it worked well live." The song was written in a very unconventional way for McCartney, being that it was actually written as a poem first and put to music later.
It's one of the few songs I've written where the words came first. That almost never happens. I usually have an instrument, so I'd started work on the lyrics on the bus.
Both McCartney and Lennon attest to the song being written entirely by Paul.
All my loving is Paul. I regret to say, ha ha ha, brackets, no, because it's a damn good piece. Yeah. All my loving. But I play a pretty mean guitar in back of that. Diddly 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 diddly. That's me.
Different styles of songwriting can be detected in the finished product, such as Carl Perkins and the popular girl groups of the early 60s. But McCartney claims his initial inspiration is coming through an unlikely source. At that point, McCartney says, it was a straight country and western love song. With songwriting, you conceive of it in one genre, because you can't conceive of things in thousands of genres, and you have one way of hearing it. If you get it right, however, you realize it has a certain elasticity. songs can be flexible. And when other members of the Beatles would get into the studio, often that's when the elasticity would click in. When interviewed during their extensive American tour in the fall of 1964, Ringo stated that country music hadn't influenced their sound at all. Little did he know that it actually had, as evidenced in All My Loving. It's a letter song, Paul continues, in the same vein as the epistolary song P.S. I Love You. It's part of a tradition of letter songs, like Fats Waller's I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Write Myself a Letter, or Pat Boone's 1956 hit I'll Be Home. So, All My Loving is a song that has a lineage. The recording took place on July 30th, 1963. Takes 1 through 11 needed to create a full band run-through of the song, which included McCartney's vocals as well as all of the group on their usual instruments. This actually comprised 10 takes, since there was no take 5. Take 11 was considered the best. Since Paul wanted to double-track his vocals, as well as provide his own harmony vocals on the third verse, the engineering team re-recorded Take 11 from the original 2-track tape onto another 2-track machine, while Paul simultaneously recorded his new vocal parts. 3 attempts were made at perfecting his vocals, these being documented as takes 12, 13, and 14, Take 14 being deemed the best. This is the complete version of this classic track as we know it.
The thing that strikes me about the All My Loving recording is John's guitar part. He's playing the chords as triplets. That was a last-minute idea, and it transforms the whole thing, giving it momentum.
The song is obviously about someone leaving to go on a trip, and that driving rhythm of John's echoes the feeling of travel and motion. It sounds like a car's wheels on the motorway, which, if you can believe it, had only really become a thing in the UK at the end of the 50s. But it was often like that when we were recording. One of us would come up with a little magic thing. It allowed the song to become what it needed to be. Classical music students have claimed that a tune from Tchaikovsky is buried somewhere in the melody of All My Loving. If this claim was ever heard by the Beatles, it assuredly would have caused hysterical laughter, as they always were amused by the over-analyzation of their music received from both the press and fans alike. What was apparent was that Paul showed that he was capable of writing irresistible and unforgettable melodies. Some claimed that this was the most commercial song they had recorded to date, which, amazingly enough, wasn't issued as a single in Britain or America. The optimism and confidence of this song made it a standout on the With the Beatles album, and showed McCartney to be a true competitor with Lennon as a singer and a songwriter.
And we were very close to the Stones. This song we're going to play, I Want to Be Your Man, which we virtually finished off in front of them, because they needed a record. They'd put out Come On by Chuck Berry, and they needed a quick follow-up.
By late 1963, the role of Ringo Starr within the Beatles was becoming increasingly important. In the Cavern Hamburg days of 1962 and earlier, a solo vocal spot was secured for Ringo, as with Pete Best earlier, to provide a performance spotlight on each member of the band. As fame increased in early '63, the Beatles' national tours required a much more abbreviated set list, so Ringo's vocal spotlight, Boys, was usually omitted. However, as their legion of fans grew larger and larger throughout the year, lots continued to be cast among Britain's youth as to which was each one's favorite Beatle. Ringo's popularity continued to increase to the point where chants of "Ringo! Ringo!" were being heard at their performances. In order to satisfy public demand, it was decided to once again include a vocal spotlight for Ringo in their performances. It also became obvious that another song was needed to be added to their drummer's repertoire. It was decided by John and Paul that they would compose a new song, particularly for their drummer to sing. After presenting the newly written song Little Child for Ringo's approval, and him thereby rejecting it, the duo set out to write something more suited for what he would be capable of performing live. The origins of the song began when, as witnessed by Ron King, who was the driver for the Beatles during their British touring schedule, John Lennon jotted down the phrase, "I Wanna Be Your Man" as a song title idea as he read in a newspaper. Lennon was prone to keep a list of ideas such as this for possible inclusion as lines or titles of future songs. At some point, McCartney must have been clued into this idea because he was the one to begin writing a song around this phrase with the intention of giving it to Ringo to sing. This must have taken place in September 1963, since Little Child, also written early this month, had already been rejected by Ringo. Although there are a few variations to the story from this point, our best bet is to defer to McCartney's first-hand recollection of the story. Regarding his intent for the song, Paul states in his book Many Years From Now, "We often used to say to people, the words don't really matter. People don't listen to the words, it's the sound they listen to." I Wanna Be Your Man was to try and give Ringo something like Boys, an up-tempo song he could sing from the drums. So again, it had to be very simple. Using Boys as a pattern, Paul came up with the verses, but abandoned it after having difficulty coming up with a bridge or chorus to go with it. Nonetheless, it had already been decided that this was the song Ringo was going to sing. Here's where a chance meeting resulted in the song being completed just before the Beatles brought it into the recording studio. In his 2021 book, The Lyrics, Paul relates the events that occurred on September 10th, 1963. One day, around the time we moved down to London from Liverpool in late summer of 1963, John and I were in Charing Cross Road, which was Guitar Central. We would get a taxi and go down there just to look at the guitars. The whole place in the early 60s was guitar shops, and we'd just go there and gaze longingly all afternoon at guitars we could not afford. We were looking at guitars the one day when a black London cab went by, and we noticed Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in it. So we yelled, "Hey!" They saw us waving, so they pulled over. We ran up and said, "Hey, give us a lift." "Yeah, all right." "Where are you going?" "We're going to North London." So we were just chatting in the car about what we were doing. "Oh, we've got a recording contract," Mick told us. "The only trouble is, we haven't got a new single." They asked if we had any songs, and I said, "Well, there's a song. I think it would work great for you guys." In 2016, Paul related, "We were friends with them, and I just thought I Wanna Be Your Man would be good for them. I knew they did Bo Diddley stuff, and they made a good job of it." Lennon and McCartney were then invited to come with them to a club called Studio 51 in Great Newport Street in London, where the Rolling Stones were rehearsing. It was clear that their manager, Andrew Oldham, was anxious to find material for his clients to record, and there was pressure from Decca Records to release a second single. Mick Jagger explained in 1968, "We knew the Beatles by then and we were rehearsing, and Andrew Oldham brought Paul and John down to the rehearsal. They said they had this tune. They were really hustlers then. I mean, the way they used to hustle tunes was great. Hey Mick, we've got this great song." So they played it, and we thought it sounded pretty commercial, which is what we were looking for. So we did it like Elmore James or something. They agreed to use it, but they needed a finished song. Reportedly, John then stated, "Listen, if you guys really like the main part of the song, we'll finish it for you right now." As related in David Sheff's book, All We Are Saying, Lennon's account from 1980 states,
I think we finished off for the Stones. They wanted a song, and we went to see them to see what kind of stuff they did. And Mick and Keith have told the story that we hadn't finished it. You know, Paul just had this bit, and we need another verse or something. And we sort of played it roughly to them, and they said, "Yeah, okay, well, that's our style." So Paul and I just went off in the corner of the room and finished the song off while they were all still there talking, and we came back, and that's when Mick and Keith got inspired to write. They said, "Jesus, look, they just went in the corner and wrote it and came back." You know, right in front of their eyes we did it, you know, and we gave it to them. It was a throwaway.
It was at that moment that John added the chorus, with only the title of the song being repeated 4 times as the lyrics. This corresponds with what Lennon at one point said regarding the song. "Both of us wrote it, but mainly Paul. I helped him finish it." Bassist Bill Wyman adds, "We kind of learned it pretty quickly because there wasn't much to learn. Then Brian Jones got his slide out, his steel guitar out, and da-da-da-da, and we said, yeah, that's better. Dirty it up a bit and bash it out. And we were kind of completely turned the song around and made it much more tough, Stones and Elmore James-like." Mick Jagger adds, "Nobody really produced it. It was completely crackers. but it was a hit and it sounded great on stage. As history testifies, the Rolling Stones did record the song on October 7th, 1963, becoming their first big British hit, peaking at number 12 in the UK, missing the top 40 spot in the US. Their version of I Wanna Be Your Man also became the first song ever to be performed on the BBC television show Top of the Pops on January 1st, 1964, a small portion of this performance being featured in the Beatles anthology TV documentary. However, history also shows that the Beatles still decided to record the song themselves as a vocal highlight for Ringo on their second album, With the Beatles. The day after their chance meeting with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and their offering the song to the Rolling Stones on September 10, 1963, the Beatles entered EMI Recording Studios on September 11, 1963, to begin recording it themselves. As to the inspiration for the song, other than trying to mimic the Shirelles song Boys, McCartney describes the song as a Bo Diddley kind of thing, but also credits the song Fortune Teller by Benny Spellman for the last phrase in the chorus, I wanna be your man, with the downturned final note. The style of the song can also be credited to a favorite of the Beatles, Some Other Guy, originally recorded by Richie Barrett and included in the Beatles set lists well into their national tours of 1963. This song included the downturned final note as well. For such a simple song, the Beatles had a quite difficult time recording it, probably due to the song just being recently composed and the rest of the group not being exactly sure what kind of arrangement would suit it. After one take, it was decided to leave it for another day. The next day, September 12, 1963, they returned to the song during the evening session. After working extensively on Don't Bother Me and Little Child, the Beatles returned to I Wanna Be Your Man at approximately 10:45 p.m. for 6 more takes, numbered 2 through 7. The Beatles played their usual instruments while Ringo sang his lead vocal live on these takes. Take 7 was considered the best at this point, this being a composite of 2 takes edited together just before the final verse, and they called it a night, although much more work would be needed on this track. 2.5 weeks later, on September 30th, another recording session took place which included I Wanna Be Your Man, although the Beatles were not involved. While they were out of the country, George Martin took it upon himself to overdub a Hammond organ onto the song, beginning approximately at 8:30 a.m., with the original 2-track tape being re-recorded onto another 2-track machine. George Martin made 6 attempts at recording this overdub simultaneously onto take 7 from September 12th, and the last attempt was deemed best, which took the song to take 13. Interestingly, the liner notes from the British With the Beatles album state that John Lennon played the Hammond organ, but official documentation confirms otherwise. 3 days later, on October 3rd, the Beatles, minus George Harrison, reassembled in Studio 2 of EMI for more work on the song. This 3-hour session took place from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and started with Ringo double-tracking his vocal and adding maracas to the song simultaneous to the 2-track tape of Take 13 being re-recorded once again onto another 2-track machine. 2 attempts of this overdub now brought the song to take 15. With the deadline for completing their second British album perilously close, the Beatles all convened once again in Studio 2 of EMI on October 23, 1963, for their final contribution to the album, which was a tambourine overdub by Ringo for I Wanna Be Your Man. This last overdub was recorded at the beginning of the session by the same process of once again re-recording the 2-track tape onto another 2-track machine while Ringo performed the new tambourine overdub, this being accomplished between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. After this was done, the Beatles observed George Martin and Norman Smith preparing a mono mix with the final fade-out of the song, as well as for Little Child and Hold Me Tight. Although the Rolling Stones were the ones to achieve British chart success with the song, because of the nearly 3 years of performance history, I Wanna Be Your Man will always be affectionately known as a Beatles song, and more appropriately, as a Ringo song. In the early years of Beatlemania, Lennon and McCartney wrote 2 main types of songs: Hit songs and work songs. The hit songs were inspired pieces they carefully crafted together, often sitting eyeball to perfect the chords, melodies, and harmonies. These were written with the clear goal of becoming successful Beatles singles, and the pair brought them into the studio with the full confidence that they would top the charts. By contrast, work songs were written more casually, often for other artists, managed by Brian Epstein, who encouraged the practice both for royalties and to boost his clients' sales. Some of these songs also served as fillers for Beatles albums, or as material for George or Ringo. This is where Little Child comes in. British 50s folk singer Elton Hayes appears to be a partial inspiration for the song Little Child, according to Paul. I nicked a bit of the melody from one of his tunes, I'm so sad and lonely. That little bit came from a line, whistle my love and I will come to thee, I'll always find you, explained Paul, adding, I think it was from a Robin Hood film. The song was in fact entitled Whistle My Love, from the 1952 Walt Disney movie, The Story of Robin Hood and His Merry Men, written by George Weil and Eddie Pola. This appears to be the only noteworthy inspiration for the song, which was written with the sole intention of providing a song for Ringo to sing for their second British album. Certain songs were inspirational and you just followed that, explained Paul. Certain other songs were, right, come on, 2 hours, song for Ringo for the album. The only prerequisite in writing the song was to make it fairly simple for the drummer to sing, as Paul explained. He didn't have a large vocal range, but he could handle things with good con brio and spirito if they were nice and simple. It had to be something he could get behind. If he couldn't mentally picture it, you were in trouble. Apparently, Ringo couldn't get behind this song and passed on it. It's hard to imagine Ringo vocalizing melody lines such as the one that accompanies I'm so sad and lonely. Number 20, Forthland Road, Allerton, was the home of the McCartney family from 1955 to 64. Paul and John would frequently skip school and meet back at Paul's Forthland Road home to write songs while the rest of the family were away. While Paul had written the bulk of Hold Me Tight sometime in 1961, as evidenced by the song being included in some Beatles performances that year, it was here at Paul's Forthland Road home, shortly after their September 11, 1962 recording session, which produced Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, that Paul and John collaborated in finishing up the writing of Hold Me Tight as a possible future hit single. When we first started, it was all singles, and we were always trying to write singles, Paul stated in his book Many Years From Now. That's why you get lots of these 2-minute, 30-second songs. They all came out the same length. Hold Me Tight was a failed attempt at a single which then became an acceptable album filler. John concurred, talking to David Sheff in 1980. That was Paul's. Maybe I stuck some bits in there, I don't remember. It was a pretty poor song, and I was never really interested in it either way. Regardless of their dismissal of the song in later interviews, they obviously put a lot of work into it during the writing process. Hold Me Tight was one of the 5 original Lennon-McCartney compositions recorded during their marathon recording session on February 11th, 1963, to complete their first album, Please Please Me. Since they were determined to achieve success by recording their own compositions, like their musical heroes Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and Carl Perkins, they set out to record as many of their original songs as possible. 6 other songs were started and completed during this full day at EMI Studio 2, making a total of 11 songs in one day. In this case, though, the 14-song requirement for a standard album was filled without Hold Me Tight. And, possibly, to save the trouble of editing on a tight budget, this song became the 15th song that wasn't needed. The A and B sides of their first 2 singles, including Please Please Me, filled the other tracks on the album. At this point in the game, the budget allocated for an upcoming new group was minimal, hence the one-day rush schedule for recording an album. Whatever the reason may have been, Hold Me Tight was deemed the weakest track and didn't make the album. Fortunately, the Beatles weren't going to let this one fall through the cracks. When pressed for new material for their second British album 7 months later, They remembered that Hold Me Tight wasn't yet released and proceeded to resurrect it. But instead of bringing out the old tape, a decision was made to start it again fresh. The reason may have been that the original tape was recorded over or already scrapped. In any event, on September 12, 1963, at their fourth recording session for the new album, the new version was finished. For a song that has been given such a bad rap over the years, discerning ears can detect a skillful use of songwriting tricks, as well as a very impressive studio performance. Its surprising inclusion in the opening segments of the 2007 Academy Award-nominated musical Across the Universe shows it as an accurate representation of teenage romance, and thereby gives the song its due merit. The only indication made in print as to the time All I've Got to Do was written is given by Steve Turner in A Hard Day's Write, suggesting sometime in the year 1961. While this very well could be the case, what is known is that the Beatles never performed the song live throughout their career, whether in their formative years at the Cavern or in Hamburg, nor after their fame solidified from 1963 onward. On the surface, this makes the 1961 claim seem unlikely, since the claim cannot be substantiated from any other source as of this writing. An undeniable fact is that the Beatles had the habit of utilizing every original composition in their live sets throughout the early years. But, to play devil's advocate, we must consider that since it has been well established that this is a 100% Lennon composition, he could have held this song close to his chest throughout those formative years, and only pulled it out when a new composition was sorely needed for inclusion on their second album with the Beatles. Either way, what is known is that Paul, George, and Ringo were entirely unaware of the existence of this song on the day that they were introduced to it in the studio when it was recorded. Author Barry Miles, in his McCartney biography many years from now, states that All I've Got to Do was showed to Paul only in the studio just before recording. This studio procedure of introducing a new song on the day of the recording session was totally new to the Beatles up to this point, although it became much more of a standard practice as time went on. The pressure of finishing a second album before the end of the year of 1963 may have appeared as a daunting task, which may have instigated the desperate act of Lennon purging his memory to reveal this gem. Similar desperate acts happened in later years for the same reason, such as with the beautiful Michelle for Rubber Soul at the end of 1965. A rare quote from John concerning this song, as related in David Sheff's book All We Are Saying, reveals that it was his attempt at trying to do Smokey Robinson again. Much of Lennon's early songwriting style on the album has been admittedly inspired by Smokey Robinson, not to mention the group's excellent cover of his recent hit, You've Really Got a Hold on Me. It should be noted, however, that the Jerry Reed written hit, That's All You Gotta Do, as recorded by Brenda Lee, which peaked at number 6 on the American Billboard Hot 100 in 1960, has remarkably similar lyrics, right down to the plea for a boy to call me on the telephone. Therefore, this song is quite likely to have been an influence in writing All I've Got to Do, if even only subliminally. All I've Got to Do was recorded on September 11th, 1963, at EMI Studio 2 during an afternoon session that began after abandoned attempts at I Wanna Be Your Man and Little Child. John introduced the song to the group, and they recorded 14 live takes, 8 of which were false starts as the band was still learning it. Take 14 was judged best and was copied onto another 2-track machine for an overdub, creating Take 15, which became the finished master. The session ended at 6 p.m., and the song was never performed by the Beatles ever again. The song structure for All I've Got to Do is uniquely similar to the cover version of A Taste of Honey that the Beatles did on their first album. The similarity lies in the use of a refrain instead of a bridge, the difference between the two being the finality a refrain provides, which, while not necessarily repeating the title of the song in the lyrics, usually completes the framework of the song and returns you to the home key. The overall structure of the song, therefore, is verse, verse, refrain, or AABAB. The first through 6 measures of the verse display Paul playing dual strings simultaneously on his bass, following the pattern Ringo plays on his kick drum, this being quite innovative considering Paul had just been introduced to the song that day. This technique is arguably the first time in the history of rock music that a bass guitarist played multiple strings simultaneously in a rock and roll song. Although the simplified lyrics are somewhat cliched and predictable, paired with this melody line, chord structure, and vocal style, they come across as appropriate and convincing. Simply put, the message is very clear that the singer's needs are met by his girl whenever they are requested, and, to be fair, her needs are graciously met in return. The only catch is to ask, and that's all they've got to do. With all of the creative songwriting output from the Lennon-McCartney team in '63, as well as the magnitude of their incredibly busy schedule during the beginnings of their catapult to fame, it is only to be expected that a song or two might not receive the attention it rightfully deserved, even if that song is great. This is truly the case with All I've Got to Do. Even the Beatles themselves viewed it with little regard. In their entire career, this song was only in their focus for one day, the day it was recorded. Even in interviews about their songwriting throughout the rest of their lives, both John and Paul barely mention a word about the song. It has never appeared in any compilation or greatest hits package. Harmonic interest is typical of their quicker songs, and one gets the impression that they think simultaneously of harmony and melody, so firmly are the major tonic sevenths and ninths built into their tunes, and the flat submediant key switches, so natural is the Aeolian cadence at the end of Not a Second Time, the chord progression which ends Mahler's Song of the Earth. This is a quote from William Mann, who was back then the music critic of the Times in London. This article, titled What Songs the Beatles Sang, was printed on December 23, 1963, just over a month after the release of With the Beatles in the UK. This critical analysis was unlike any media exposure the Beatles were getting up to at this time, most of which consisted of reports of the mass hysteria that accompanied their appearances. What this article accomplished was the adding of an enormous amount of credibility to the Beatles' music. It assisted with the squelching of complaints from parents that their teenage kids were just idolizing long-haired, talentless noisemakers. John Lennon referred to the article in interviews many times over the years, emphasizing that this review was responsible for starting the whole intellectual bit about the Beatles. The term Aeolian cadence became an often mentioned term in the tabloid press at the time, which sounded very impressive with respect to the Beatles' music, but was viewed as humorous by the group. I can't help having a quiet giggle when straight-faced critics start feeding all sorts of hidden meanings into the stuff we write, Lennon remarked in '65. William Mann wrote the intellectual article about the Beatles. He used a whole lot of musical terminology, and he's a twit. In the '70s, John seemed to change his attitude about the review. I still don't know what it means at the end, but he made us acceptable to the intellectuals. It worked, and we were flattered. I composed Not a Second Time, and really, it was just chords like any other chords. McCartney agreed, saying, "We hadn't been conscious of any of that. We just did our songs in hotel rooms whenever we had a spare moment, John and I, sitting on twin beds with guitars." Instinct is what propelled Lennon and McCartney to write what they did over the years, given that they had no formal musical training. They wrote by feel, which John testified to in '73. Intellectuals have the problem of having to understand it. They can't feel anything. The only way to get an intellectual is to talk to him and then play him the record. You couldn't put a record on and just let him hear it. It has been confirmed by both Lennon and McCartney that Not a Second Time was written entirely by John. Both of them have also confirmed in interviews that John was influenced by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles for the song, Lennon stating in the anthology book that he was trying to write a Smokey Robinson or something at the time. While Lennon tended to write lyrics first and then fit the chords and melody around the words, the Smokey Robinson influence can clearly be detected in the melody he wrote to accompany the lyrics, such as the trapped in a controlling relationship subject, this also being evidenced in the miracles, "You've Really Got a Hold on Me." It can be presumed by listening to the finished product that the song was written shortly before being recorded. It appears that John is the only Beatle fully acquainted with the song, as Paul and George's parts are faintly heard and rudimentary. No vocal harmonies were deemed necessary, although they could have been implemented to great effect if they had been so inclined at the time. Producer George Martin can easily be recognized as contributing the bulk of the musicianship on the recording, as his piano parts dominate throughout. Although no records or interviews exist that detail when the song was written, it can be assumed that it was composed sometime in early September of 1963, just before the recording took place. 5 takes were made of the basic track on September 11, 1963, which consisted of John singing and all 4 Beatles playing live. Take 5 was deemed the best, ready for overdubs. It has been suggested by some sources that McCartney did not participate at all, since the piano part, which was overdubbed afterward by George Martin, focuses on the bass notes of the song. The same can be said about George Harrison's contribution, since only one guitar can be detected in the released recording. We do know with certainty that both McCartney and Harrison were present earlier this day for the recording of All I've Got to Do, in which their contributions can easily be heard. Surely, Harrison would have also been present for the evening session, since his composition Don't Bother Me was premiered that day. All evidence suggests that these 5 takes of the basic track were recorded by all 4 Beatles. John would later be known to stray drastically from the conformities of songwriting structures, but it's not usually detectable this early on in the Beatles' career. Not a second time is quite a lot of these heterodoxies, which can become confusing when analyzed. Musicologist Ian MacDonald, in his book Revolution in the Head, describes the structure of the song as a rambling affair composed of an irregular 14-bar verse joined to a 10-bar chorus, which sounds like a middle 8. To generalize the song, we see a verse-refrain structure, or AAB, which on the surface seems not unlike the structure for All My Loving, but first of all, the second verse is a variant of the first, which makes the second verse unique. Also, a solo section is included in the song, but in this first case, it's placed on top of the refrain chords, which is quite unusual, especially since it appears right after a true refrain is heard. We then hear an exact repeat of this pattern with the same lyrics. So in essence, we hear the same song twice in a row. Then we have a conclusion, or outro if you will, which is a variation on the initial verse, but is in actuality quite different. So if we're going to be exact, the complete structure of the song is initial verse, variant verse, refrain, refrain, initial verse, variant verse, refrain, outro, or A, B, C, C, A, B, C, D. And if we're not at all confused already, each verse is an unusual 7 measures long, while each refrain is an equally unusual 10 measures long. Is this to say that Lennon didn't know what he was doing? Or that he was a genius? The verdict is actually both. While it is true that John was not musically trained and couldn't read music, he was truly gifted with an ability to express the emotions of what he witnessed in the music he listened to. If he was currently enamored with Smokey Robinson at a given time, as he was during this album, he could vividly express the emotions and sentiments of what those songs portrayed. If Bob Dylan was John's current inspiration, as evidenced in late '64 and early '65, then we can easily hear the influence. Lennon may have downplayed his songwriting abilities, as he once stated, "It's a bit haphazard, there's no rules for writing." He also admitted that he wrote by feel. Those feelings, tempered by the structural collaborations from McCartney, made them the outstanding songwriting partnership that they're known for today. In the instance of Not a Second Time, we see the example of songwriting by feel in its rawest form, since Lennon wrote the song completely on his own. Lennon's double-tracked vocals stray quite a bit from each other during the song's fade-out, displaying the results of a mistake that sounded too good to correct. Concerning these accidents, Jeff Emerick explains, "When someone made a mistake like that and the other Beatles liked it, we'd often actually make it louder when we'd mix the song so as to accentuate it. It was all about playing a joke on the fans. giving them a treat, something to talk about. On the surface, John Lennon's lyrics portray being wounded by a lover who had ended the old relationship, but then changes her mind and tries to convince him using the same old lines. He couldn't face the possibility of being hurt all over again, so his resolve is not to allow her back into his life. But in the true fashion of Smokey Robinson, the context of the chord pattern that ends the refrain, as in Gustav Mahler's Song of the Earth, intimates that he is actually wavering in his resolve. Why else, it is suggested, would the refrain end in a minor chord when stating the key phrase, not a second time, instead of the expected major signature chord? Deep stuff. We also see here another example of John revealing his vulnerable inner self apart from his rough exterior. The word cry is highlighted many times in the song, as is evident in many of his songs throughout their career. Lennon's vocal work is painfully convincing throughout, with the usual double tracking being utilized to good effect. Since the first vocal track and Lennon's acoustic guitar were recorded simultaneously, it can be easily seen how the song would stand alone as a singer-songwriter acoustic solo performance. Ringo comes through as a trooper in a song which he was not very familiar with, but with amazing aplomb. His rock-steady beat and predetermined drum fills are very appropriate for this classy and somewhat intellectual number. George Martin's appearance as pianist makes the song appear to be a keyboard-oriented track, although its songwriter no doubt intended it as a predominantly guitar song. Fortunately, George Martin doesn't showboat the song, which allows its intricate nature to speak for itself. His lower register keyboard work throughout, including the solo, suited the emotional disruption of the lyrics. With 2 sets of overdubs being recorded, the released result being a third-generation recording, Paul's bass and George's guitar contributions seem to be lost in the shuffle, reduced so far back in the mix as to be nearly indiscernible on the released version. Like other songs of this period, such as All I've Got to Do and It Won't Be Long, this song was not intended for live performances. Therefore, the song was never performed live by the Beatles or any of their individual members. They never performed it in any of their BBC radio performances either. As far as any sources can confirm, September 11th, 1963 was the first and the last day they ever played the song, individually or collectively.
First song I ever wrote was in Bournemouth, to be around 1963. It was after our first success, and we were doing weekly shows in holiday resorts. So we were in Bournemouth, and I was feeling sick. In fact, I was in bed sick, and the doctor was giving me some tonic. And I just thought, I'll see if I can write a song. So I wrote one, and it was an awful song, and it was called Don't Bother Me, which I suppose is how I felt at the time.
Professional songwriting is a true craft. Anyone who has ever written a hit song will guard their early attempts at songwriting from being exposed to the world with his or her life out of sheer embarrassment, no doubt. In almost all cases, many years of trial and error precede any success that a songwriter will achieve in their lifetime. There are, of course, exceptions to any rule. George Harrison is a definite exception to this rule. Buoyed on by the success and financial advantages of Lennon and McCartney being hit-making songwriters for the Beatles, as well as other artists, George saw a potential opportunity for himself. His self-proclaimed main focus within the group was to be the best lead guitarist that he could be, especially with the enormous British success the Beatles were enjoying by mid-63. But now his focus suddenly began to shift towards songwriting. In order for George to have lead vocals to sing on their albums, he was relegated to singing cover songs in the earlier years, such as Chains, or Lennon-McCartney originals, such as Do You Want to Know a Secret? All that changed forever in August of 1963. Paul relates in the Beatles anthology, "A lot of the girls were mad on him, so we always wanted to give him at least one track. Then George started to catch on. Why should you write my songs? And he started writing his own. Actually, John and Paul were quite agreeable about including George as a songwriter for the Beatles, as he continues. It was an option to include George in the songwriting team. John and I had already talked about it. I remember walking up past Woolton Church with John one morning and going over the question. Without wanting being too mean to George, would 3 of us write, or would it be better to keep it simple? We decided we'd just keep the 2 of us. He wrote Don't Bother Me. That was the first one, and he improved from that and became very good. What is unique about this situation is that the Beatles were huge starts in Britain by the time George decided to give songwriting a try. Indeed, the band was on the brink of being properly introduced to the US market as well. I used to have a hang-up about telling John, Paul, and Ringo that I had a song for an album, George admitted in 1969, because I felt mentally, at that time, as if I was trying to compete. And in a good way, the standard of the songs had to be good, because John and Paul's were very good. I don't want the Beatles to be recording rubbish for my sake, just because I wrote it.
It was difficult for me to write some sort of crummy song and expect the Beatles to record it. And also to do a song with the Beatles, it was always a matter of trying to do the song that you thought they'd understand quickest, or the song you could get onto the tape the quickest, so not necessarily the song you thought was the best.
Instead of dismissing his very first attempt at writing a song, he confidently asserted himself in introducing that song as a contender for their second album. On January 8, 1969, during their rehearsals of George's song "EMI Mine" at Twickenham Studios, George elaborated farther about the writing of Don't Bother Me. I know I was in bed at Bournemouth. We were on a summer season, and the doctor gave me some tonic, which must have had amphetamine or something in it, and the rest of you all just drank it to get high, and that's when I wrote that one. While in bed, George recorded his songwriting experience on a portable tape recorder. A portion of this recording later surfacing that displays him writing the song's bridge while whistling the melody line. In regards to inspiration, an unconfirmed experience sheds a little light on the subject for Don't Bother Me. Bill Harry, a longtime friend of the Beatles and a founder of the Liverpool music paper Mersey Beat, used to pester George repeatedly to become a songwriter like his bandmates were. He would ask George if he had written one yet whenever he would run into him. Harry relates, "When George was about to go out one night, he thought he might bump into me, so he started writing a number which he called Don't Bother Me." While this may or may not be just an amusing anecdote, what is confirmed is that George wrote this dourly resentful song because he felt low and wanted to be left alone. The self-admitted exercise of writing a song did have a lucrative outcome in the long run. Not only did the song itself provide George with a taste of the financial success that Lennon and McCartney were enjoying, but the benefits extended much further. George related, "At least it showed me that all I needed to do was keep on writing, and maybe eventually I would write something good." It did, however, provide me with an occupation. Since this first Harrison composition predated the 5-year contract he signed with Northern Songs on November 9, 1963, Don't Bother Me was published by the Dick James-Brian Epstein partnership called Cheap Music. His new songwriting occupation broadened his outlook as well as his role within the Beatles. Not only was he their lead guitarist, but now a contributing songwriter as well. This role as songwriter would continue to grow in quantity as well as quality throughout the Beatles' career, throughout his solo years, and for the rest of his life. September 11, 1963 became the first Beatles recording session to feature a George Harrison composition, this taking place in EMI Studio 2. 4 full band performances were recorded on this day. John, being in an experimental mood, tried out a new gadget they had purchased a few months earlier at Selmer's Music Store in London, this being a Gibson Maestro fuzztone. George had attempted to use this early distortion effect during the sessions for She Loves You back on July 1st of that year, but they decided not to use it on the final recording. John was eager to get some use out of it on this day and tried it out on the early attempts at the rhythm track. According to the September 28, 1963 issue of Melody Maker, a journalist was present in EMI Studio 2 on this day. He reported, "When they had rearranged the opening bars, John produced a fuzz box. John was knocked out with the result, but George Martin wasn't too happy. 'You'll have to do something, John,' said George Martin. 'It's already distorting from the amplifier. Do you think it sounds okay? Are you sure about it?' Apparently, the use of this device was shelved for the day, the effect not being used until George's Think for Yourself was recorded 2 years later. Still wanting to try something new, George asked engineer Norman Smith, "Can we have a compressor on this guitar? We might try to get a sort of organ sound." What they came up with was the use of the amplifier tremolo on John's guitar, which provided a rhythmic fluctuation of volume. As stated in Andy Babiak's book, Beatles Gear, this was the group's first evident use in the studio of an electronic effect on the guitar sound, and thus marked the start of a search for unusual sounds and heralded the group's role as studio experimenters in coming years. On the next day, September 12th, they resumed work on the song in Studio 2, once again during that day's evening session. The group then decided to incorporate a Beatles break just before George began singing the first verse. With this in mind, take 11 broke down just into the first verse. Take 12 got a little further, although Ringo kept putting these breaks in the wrong places, resulting in George stopping the recording saying, "No, no, no." According to Walter Everett's book, The Beatles as Musicians, John tried to achieve a dirty sound on his rhythm guitar by raising the signal gain, and George Martin instead suggested the use of compressor to achieve the desired organ sound, the tremolo effect on his amplifier also being used to simulate a sinister sound as heard on recordings by British hitmakers The Shadows. Take 13, which then omitted the first Beatles break, was deemed best. The released recording, however, shows Ringo mistakenly performing a break just before the first bridge during the words, "I know I'll." With this 2-track tape being re-recorded onto another 2-track machine, each Beatle simultaneously overdubs different elements. 6 attempts at this overdub recording being made. George double-tracked his lead vocal, Paul played claves, John played tambourine, and Ringo played an Arabian bongo. All of these percussive instruments being found when they raided the EMI closet, which was located underneath the steps leading up to the control room. The second attempt at the overdubs, take 15, was considered the best in the end, although they continued overdubbing through take 19, none of these later takes being used. Following the lead of the majority of Lennon-McCartney compositions written thus far, George chose to follow the usual established pattern of verse, verse, bridge, verse, or AABA for Don't Bother Me. Predictably for a lead guitarist, a guitar solo spot was written into the song, which extends the pattern to include another verse to accommodate the guitar solo, another bridge, and then a final extended verse. The song follows a pattern of many Harris songs within the Beatles' catalog, being in a minor key with sad/angry lyrics. Musicologists have stated that the sign of a well-written lyric is the summation of the gist of the entire song in the first sentence heard. On George's first try, he gets it about right. "Since she's been gone, I want no one to talk to me," states in a nutshell what the song is about. The rest of the lyrics elaborate with more detail without becoming redundant or changing the story. George has truly added another dimension to the songwriting palette of the Beatles, which are thus far depicting happy-go-lucky youths with nothing but positive experiences to sing about. The sorrow mentioned in There's a Place, as an example, is greatly overshadowed by optimism, while misery is definitely sung tongue-in-cheek, with Baby It's You, although a cover song, loss is depicted in a convincing way. The difference being that the lover in the song was the one who was the cheat, not the singer. Therefore, Don't Bother Me shows that the Beatles themselves were indeed capable of being scoundrels as well, capable of doing the unthinkable wrong of cheating on someone. Since George's lyrics show him reaping what he has sown, their fans can at least assume that the boys have consciences.
First major experience of my life and my generation where we were open to something more, some more energy and more possibilities are open to us. For me was February 1964 when I saw you on the Ed Sullivan Show. It was like somebody just swept over the whole country.
It was funny, wasn't it? Huh?
Now, what the hell was it all about?
Was it that? I don't know. I personally think that, like in America, there was very much a way to do things, and the only slightly freaky things would be like the Hollywood writers or the jazz musicians, or the pop musicians, the Elvises, and so on and so, they were being different. But in America, they were all still in a framework.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the British thing that we cooked up, we had a long time to cook it up quietly, make all our mistakes in private, Hamburg. Well, no one was watching. By the time one of the big things about the Beatles, which I always think new groups should take as a bit of advice, was that we were cheeky enough to say we won't go to the States ever till we've got a #1 record. Which is a pretty cheeky kind of thing.
In the States,
cocky
#1
thing.
record.
Yeah, in the
Okay.
States. So we were offered tours, but we knew we'd be second to someone. We didn't want that. And there were a lot of artists still from here who go over. Sex Pistols, and they vanish. Cliff Richard, still trying to make it in the States. And we always looked at it logically and thought, well, that's the mistake. They've got to go in as #1. Then they're going to do. So there was a lot of careful thought here. We were cooking up this act, the Beatles. It was very European, very sort of British, as opposed to like the standard American way of doing things. Ed, a couple of jugglers, Sinatra Jr., even Elvis from the waist up. There was a very definite way that the Americans did it, the American dream. I just think that like Americans had it going one certain way, and the Beatles was just such a different thing that we'd been cooking up. We'd been taking all the influences from America, distilling them in a British way. A lot of things have been happening just with our own chemistry, because you had John and I were strong writers, George who was like a third writer, Ringo who had like a good head on his shoulders and was by no means thick, and we were just developing our chemistry. We put in a lot of work. Hamburg used to work 8 hours a day, which most bands never worked that hard. We literally worked 8 hours a day, and it was a full factory day. So we had developed our act. By the time we came to America, we had a #1 record, which we'd worked that out. We were playing in Paris at the time, and Telegram came, and we all jumped on each other's backs and ran around everywhere. And Big Mal, the roadie, used to give everyone piggybacks everywhere. We were just so excited. So we went to America. There it all was what we'd planned might happen. But we were lucky, and it went much further than we'd ever imagined. But actually, we'd thought the whole thing out. And so there was like a combination of all this thing, America being what it was, and us coming with this whole new thing that we'd thought out, based on the old thing, but with our own sort of variations on it. All the little success we'd been having in Britain. The newspapers in Britain had been saying, well, what's left to do? You've conquered everywhere. And we'd say, America. So, oh yeah, of course, yeah. We'd say, America, watch out. You know. Got the #1, went to America, did Ed Sullivan. By then we'd like distilled our stuff down to an essence. So we weren't just coming on as just any old band. We had our identity, this total new identity for us.
Could you feel that among you? Was there a particular spirit?
Yeah, we knew it. Yeah. Well, people were saying, what's this with the haircuts? Now, if I go back on the haircut thing, I know it was actually because we saw some guy in Hamburg whose hair we liked. John and I were hitchhiking to Paris. We asked him to cut our hair like he did his. He didn't do it quite the same as his, and it fell down in a Beatles cut. His was actually more like this, coming over to one side.
Hitler, yes.
Not Hitler, but a kind of long-haired Hitler thing.
Yeah, no, I know.
All coming down. And we wanted that.
He was Lawrence, actually. That's the way his hair was.
He was a very sort of artsy guy, this guy. He was a great guy called Jürgen. He was a photographer, friend of everyone's, from Hamburg. And he was living in Paris. He cut our hair. We just came back to England. All the people in England thought we were German, because the newspapers said direct from Hamburg,
right.
The Beatles. So all the kids thought we were German. They were all surprised. We had leather jackets and blue jeans. We went out of that phase and went more suits, because we were going to come down to London, and we developed the sort of suits thing, and we thought we won't have corny suits, we'll have nude kind of things. We got those cardan jackets. We were working on the whole thing, and so by the time we sort of got to the States there, to say, for instance, the hair, what was really a bit of an accident, and it was really sort of what a lot of artsy people were doing anyway. We were the first with it in the States, so it looked like we'd invented it. Actually, the story was not half as exciting. It was much more ordinary, like life is. But by the time it actually got to the presentation on the Ed Sullivan Show, the biggest show in the States, and there we were with these funny haircuts, it was us. Everyone used to say, you started the Beatle haircut.
With this monumental hit song, England's phenomenal pop combo, as the Meet the Beatles front cover described them, the boys immediately became America's phenomenal pop combo. Most US residents paying attention in 1964 will undoubtedly say that I Want to Hold Your Hand was their indoctrination into Beatlemania. While their first 3 US single releases of '63 only made tiny ripples in the pond that was American music, this single, rushed release on December 26, 1963, was the tsunami that not only dominated the record charts, but also monopolized the hearts and minds of the entire population of the country. Everyone, young and old, was curious who the originator of this incredibly unique sounding music could be. The single was originally scheduled for release on January 13, 1964, but the release date was moved forward due to great public demand. This demand originated, in part, from one 15-year-old girl in Washington, D.C., named Marcia Albert. After seeing a feature on the CBS Evening News about the Beatles, she wrote a letter to a local radio station, WWDC, asking why they weren't playing anything from this huge sociological phenomenon, as the news report called them. Marcia stated in the book The Beatles' Helping Hand, "It wasn't so much what I had seen, it's what I had heard. They had a scene where they played a clip of She Loves You, and I thought it was a great song. I wrote that I thought the Beatles could really be popular here, and if WWDC disc jockey Carol James could get one of their records, that would really be great." The radio response was amazing and immediate. Listeners lighting up the phone lines at WWDC asking where they could buy this new record, which they couldn't yet. WWDC played the song repeatedly, with Carol James interrupting it in the middle of the song with the phrase, "This is a Carol James exclusive," so that no one could take the song off the air to use elsewhere. With their usual playlist consisting of songs by Bobby Vinton and Andy Williams, I Want to Hold Your Hand stood out like a sore thumb. An uninterrupted tape recording of the song was quickly sent to a disc jockey in Chicago, who also played it on the air, receiving a great response from their listeners. They in turn sent a tape copy of the song to a radio station in St. Louis, who also had the same favorable experience. This all happened within days of its first broadcast on December 17th in Washington, D.C. Capitol Records caught wind of this and threatened to arrange for a court order to stop radio stations from playing the song before their release date of January 13th, 1964. When the radio stations ignored this, Capitol realized that they needed to respond quickly in order to meet demand. Shortly thereafter, radio stations were playing any other Beatles song they could get their hands on, such as their 3 unsuccessful singles released earlier in 1963. The phenomenal impact on America was due in part to the current music trends, or lack thereof, that permeated the airwaves. Looking carefully at what was popular in American music for the previous year, you can easily see that the US was due for a new sensation. Elvis was now relegated mostly to movie soundtrack songs, while the rest of the charts were taken up by a mishmash of uneventful musical trends. Surf music was being pioneered by the Beach Boys, who flourished later after that trend wore off. Folk was in high gear, Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Rooftop Singers, and the Kingston Trio. And romantic ballad singers were strong, Steve Lawrence, Bobby Vinton, and Al Martino, as well as a vast array of novelty songs, such as Dominique, Hello Mutta, Hello Fada, and Sukiyaki. The exciting rock and roll trend that was championed in the late 50s by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Elvis had indeed died down to a low rumble. Louie Louie by the Kingsmen was not enough to revitalize the rock and roll fever that seemed to have died. The phrase, rock and roll is here to stay, appeared to have been a false claim. The Beatles stood out in full force. It was obvious that they had taken the baton from Elvis to bring the same measure of rock and roll excitement back to the US for the next generation to enjoy. Brian Epstein had been encouraging John and Paul to write something that would go over well with American audiences, since their earlier releases had flopped so badly there. With that in mind, the both of them convened in Asher's house on 57 Wimpole Street in order to write a song with American audiences specifically in mind. Paul had been dating actress Jane Asher since earlier in the year and was spending much time at her parents' house whenever he was in London. John describes the writing of the song as 50-50 collaboration, one-on-one, eyeball to eyeball, which Paul agrees with. Paul recalls, "One of the things I have always thought was the secret of the Beatles was that our music was self-taught. We were never consciously thinking of what we were doing. Anything we did came naturally. A breathtaking chord change didn't happen because we knew how that chord related to another chord. We weren't able to read music or write it down, so we just made it up. My dad was exactly the same. And there's a certain joy that comes into your stuff if you didn't mean it, if you didn't try to make it happen and it happens of its own accord. There's a certain magic about that. So much of what we did came from a deep sense of wonder rather than study. John appears to have been influenced by photographer Robert Freeman, who took the album cover's photograph for a particular part of the song. Freeman, who lived in an apartment beneath Lennon's place in Kensington, was trying to educate John in jazz and experimental music. One track on an album that Freeman introduced him to was a musical phrase repeated, as if the record had stuck, according to Freeman. John used this effect on the lines, "I can't hide, I can't hide, I can't hide." Paul continues, "There was an eroticism behind it all. If I'd heard myself use that word when I was 17, there would have been a guffaw, but eroticism was very much a driving force behind everything I did. It was a very strong thing. And you know, that was what lay behind a lot of these love songs. I want to hold your hand, open brackets, and probably do a lot more. I want to hold your hand is not about Jane, but it was certainly written when I was with her. To tell you the truth, I think we were writing more to a general audience. I may have been drawing on my experience with a person I was in love with at the time, and sometimes it was very specific, but mostly we were just writing to the world." Their excitement with the song led to them introducing it to George and Ringo and fine-tuning it before their very next recording session, which was October 17th, 1963. The recording history for the song is quite uncomplicated. The boys only needed 1 day to start and finish the song. 17 takes of the song were recorded during this session. Since the Beatles had by that time earned much more money for EMI than had the classical releases, EMI felt that the Beatles earned their keep and offered them 4-track capabilities from this date on. It is quite coincidental that, starting with this monumental recording, the Beatles were ushered into a new era of recording technology that then continued with them throughout their recording careers until 1968, when, during the recording of their White Album, EMI Studios graduated to the even more advanced 8-track recording console. After an abandoned attempt at recreating You've Really Got a Hold on Me, John confidently called up to George Martin in the control booth, "You'd better come on down here and have a listen to our next #1 record." The statement solidifies two things. First, It Won't Be Long was no longer in consideration for their next single by this time, as originally planned, and second, that George Martin was still being utilized by the Beatles for his expertise in arrangement. In this case, with the exception of a slight change in tempo and adjustments in vocal harmonies, the song was perfectly arranged in advance by them. There was little that George Martin needed to do to improve it. When listening to the 17 takes, some false starts of the song, you can't help but notice Paul's leadership role in full force even at this early stage of the Beatles' career.
Do it slower. No. Shh. Clean beginning now. 1, 2, 3. Love that. Shh. Ready? Shh. Ringo, keep your bit dead. Ringo! We're taping. First one, very initial attack. 1, 2, 3. No, the first one, allowed. Attack. The second one, not quite so loud. Just try it. Oh, well, do it anyway. We'll just blast that bit.
Paul later admitted, "I heard tapes recently of me counting in on I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I'm being pretty bossy. Clean beginning. Come on, everyone. 1, 2, come on, get it right." And I could see how that could get on your nerves. Yes, okay, in the studio I could be overbearing because I wanted to get it right. Nonetheless, as Ringo admitted, Paul's bossiness contributed to really great products, as was the case with this song. What is most definitely on display here, aside from the instrumentation, is the songwriting style of the Lennon-McCartney team, as well as the overall effect the song creates. Standout musicianship is not called for here, such as in the case of guitar solos, walking bass lines, or rollicking drum beats. They don't distract us with musical showmanship in this song because it is not needed. The effervescent vocal delivery, along with its masterful songwriting, is all that was necessary to carry this masterpiece to the heights that it achieved. George Martin has described I Want to Hold Your Hand as the apex of Phase 1 of the Beatles' development. When they started out in Love Me Do days, they weren't good writers. They stole unashamedly from existing records. It wasn't until they tasted blood that they realized they could do this, and that set them on the road to writing better songs. One can usually judge the effect of a cultural phenomenon by its detractors. The Beatles, and this song in particular, were viewed as a threat to all that was sacred and decent in the US. A sterling example of the older generation's distaste for this influence was New York radio station WNEW, continually saying on air that I Want to Hold Your Hand made some people want to hold their noses. Brett Huntley on the NBC Evening News refused to show footage of the Beatles arriving at Kennedy Airport in February of 1964, actually saying on air that because of the subject of the footage taken that day, he felt that there was absolutely no need to show any of that footage. Since 1964, what other recording artist or song has ever provoked this much resistance? Time has definitely proven to be a factor in favor of the Beatles, as now the innocence of I Want to Hold Your Hand can only leave us wondering what all the subversive talk was about.
The chord that made the song, which is I want to hold your hand. That was the whole bit. We were in downstairs in the cellar where, and I was on a piano and Paul was on a harmonium, or vice versa. And we were both playing at the same time, and we had, oh, you got that something. And then he hit that B7 chord just as we were both playing chords, and I turned and said, that's it.
Just my attempt at writing one of those three-part harmony Smokey Robinson songs, John explained about This Boy in 1980, adding, there was a period when I thought I didn't write melodies, that Paul wrote those and I just wrote straight, shouting rock and roll. But of course, when I think of some of my own songs, In My Life and some of the early stuff, This Boy, I was writing melody with the best of them. With this quote, we can assume that This Boy was written entirely by John. But Paul gives a vivid and convincing recollection otherwise in his book Many Years From Now, describing the song as another hotel bedroom song written when they had a couple of hours to kill, before getting ready for another performance sometime in September 1963. Although we don't know the exact day, in this case we know the exact time the song was written, as McCartney recalls arriving around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we thought, well, let's write one, rather like the hotel where we wrote She Loves You. Paul's account of this September writing session is uncharacteristically vivid. McCartney detailing the position of the beds, John and I sitting on twin beds, the G-plan furniture, the British hotel with the olive green and orange everywhere, that marvelous combination, the colors of vomit. In that setting, they fulfilled their desire to write a close harmony song, patterned after the three-part harmony they used in the Cavern Club days when performing the Phil Spector-written To Know Her Is to Love Her. We weren't all rock and roll, Paul continues. We could change the pace, which was always nice after you played for 3 hours. We wrote it in a 2-part harmony and then put the third part in for George to sing. We'd never actually tried to write something like that. Nice middle, John sang that great. Then we'd go back to the close harmony thing. According to George, John patterned the song after the Smokey Robinson and the Miracle song, I've Been Good to You, which has a similar circular doo-wop chord pattern, melody and arrangement. Another obvious influence used in the writing and performance of This Boy was the Bobby Freeman B-side, You Don't Understand Me, which the Beatles included in their stage act in 1960, with John singing lead. That natural ability was, of course, refined by producer George Martin in the studio. They always experimented with close harmony singing, George Martin recalled. All I did was change the odd note. This work was done in the studio with all three vocalists sitting with him at the piano while he made small but necessary adjustments in the notes they sang. Meanwhile, Ringo reportedly sat at the back of the studio smoking a cigarette and reading a comic book. After George Martin changed the odd note of their harmonies, it took 15 takes of the song to perfect, most of these takes being complete performances of the song. The bridge originally featured a guitar solo, as Mark Lewison states in the book The Beatles Recording Sessions, this apparently being included in earlier takes of This Boy, being replaced at some point by John's lead vocal spotlight. The vocals were recorded, by the group's request, with all three singers huddled around one microphone. Take 12 and Take 13, where the vocalists were humorously mixing up the songs This Boy and That Boy vocals, were included as bonus tracks on the Free as a Bird single, released in 1995. Their final attempt, Take 15, was deemed the best, and ready for an additional overdub from George Harrison. Like the vast majority of the early Beatles catalog, This Boy was written in the verse-verse-bridge-verse configuration, or AABA. The group showed themselves somewhat adventurous by delving into a full-on 12/8 waltz time signature for the first time in their career, which wasn't too unlike the 3/4 time signature used throughout most of A Taste of Honey on the first album. Paul's bass work, although low in the mix like a lot of the early Beatles songs, is impressive through his use of small 3-note runs and octave jumps throughout the verses, basically whenever he isn't singing. He seems to know when not to do bass runs, as he plays very rudimentary bass notes during the bridge, which shifts all the focus onto the lead vocal line and backing harmonies. Ever the perfectionist, Paul sings his usual higher harmony throughout the song, and always in good pitch. George plays electric rhythm guitar using a more prominent swing rhythm during the verses, utilizing all 6 beats of each measure, which provides a nice contrast to the simple chord strumming of Lennon. Harrison then drops the swing rhythm during the climactic bridge and just plays guitar chops on each beat, which then also provides a suitable contrast for the song. John liked to dismiss the lyrics to most of his early Beatles work, stating about this song that there was nothing in the lyrics, just a sound and a harmony. But there is more to this formulaic teen lyrical content than meets the eye. As was common in his early lyrics, John is portraying himself as a loser. His girl was taken away from him by someone who, the singer claims, won't be happy till he's seen her cry. John then says that he would never feel differently about the girl if he could get her back again. Lennon's lyrics depicting wallowing in misery continued to occur occasionally through 1965, this being hinted at even in Nowhere Man. John's inner anguish, as many would call it, seemed to disappear as his lyrics became much more expressive and picturesque from 1966 onwards, no doubt influenced by Dylan's encouragement to expand in his lyric writing, and by drugs, or probably both. By today's standards, the use of the simple word boy to depict the male suitor sounds extremely dated, but was quite acceptable in 1963-64 terms. As early as the Summer of Love of 1967, that dynamic changed. It would no longer be acceptable to refer to the male partner in any relationship as a boy, by any stretch of the imagination. As evidence, a little over 4 years later, Herb Alpert had a #1 hit with the similarly titled, This Guy's in Love with You. That guy was no longer a boy. Upon its release on November 22, 1963, With the Beatles was an immediate triumph. The record entered the UK charts at #1, replacing Please Please Me, which had held the top spot for an astonishing 30 weeks. It went on to remain at #1 for 21 weeks in its own right, giving the group a record-breaking 51 consecutive weeks at the summit. With the Beatles also became the very first album in the UK to sell more than 1 million copies, cementing their dominance over the record market. The Beatles were now afforded the opportunity of taking much more time in EMI Studios to record their second album. The original process of rushing through a single day of studio time to hash out an album in order to capitalize on what would be determined to be their next hit single had changed dramatically. They even graduated to 4-track recording towards the end of the sessions, which was normally never utilized for pop recordings at EMI. That's a big deal. The cover chosen for the album was inspired by German photographer and friend of the boys, Astrid Kircher. Her earlier photographs of the group while they were playing long engagements in Hamburg, Germany, included headshots of them in half lighting. These photos were then shown to photographer Robert Freeman, and, according to George Harrison, they asked him, "Can't you do it like this?" The album photo was shot in Bournemouth, England, at the Palace Court, in a room with a piece of black background, and lighting on the right side of their faces. According to Paul, the session took about a half hour and was done simply and effortlessly. By this point, Capitol Records, the EMI-owned company which was affiliated with the Beatles label Parlophone, had passed on releasing Beatles records in the US 4 times in 1963. 3 of their first 4 British singles, Love Me Do, Please Please Me, and She Loves You, were premiered by Capitol executive Dave Dexter Jr. and were rejected. Dexter was given the task of reviewing foreign EMI records to determine whether they were suitable for the American market. Because of his distaste for rock and roll, he most usually rejected these records. Even when Capitol president Alan Livingston called the great British success of the Beatles to his attention, he replied, "They're a bunch of long-haired kids. They are nothing. Forget it." Since Capitol's occasional UK releases weren't doing very well in America, Livingston trusted Dexter's opinions, and that was that. When Dexter also rejected the Beatles' next single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Brian Epstein decided to visit Capitol Records in person to address the situation. President Alan Livingston decided to sign the Beatles to Capitol after hearing I Want to Hold Your Hand himself. Surprisingly, he also agreed to Epstein's proposal that Capitol spend $40,000 to promote the Beatles in the US. Although Capitol Director of Eastern Relations, Brown Meggs, reportedly told Epstein that they did not expect a great response. A great promotional campaign was underway shortly thereafter, which, along with the US magazine and television news program exposure they were getting and the hubbub about their upcoming Ed Sullivan Show appearances, saturated the media with updates about the arrival of the Beatles. As well as quickly releasing I Want to Hold Your Hand as the first Capitol single, the label was preparing an album to capitalize on its assured success. Even though the album's full title was Meet the Beatles, the first album by England's phenomenal pop combo. The VJ label was actually the first to release a Beatles album in the US. In '63, VJ had temporarily acquired the rights to release Beatles records in America, which they did with their release of 2 unsuccessful singles, Please Please Me and From Me to You. They shelved their plans to also release an album titled Introducing the Beatles because of financial problems. But with all the promotion that Capitol gave the Beatles, as well as the magazine and television exposure, VJ decided to release the album after all, beating Capitol at their own game by 10 days. Since the VJ album was based on their debut, Please Please Me, and the Capitol album was based mostly on their follow-up with the Beatles, the US market was able to assimilate as well as achieve great success with both albums. With the exception of I Saw Her Standing There, which appeared on both of these albums, Capitol's Meet the Beatles was an entirely different album for fans to acquire. Both of these releases reached an unprecedented platinum status within the teen market, with over 1 million sold. It is the popular opinion of many that the timing was right for the Beatles' success in America because of the tragic assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, which actually coincides with the exact day that With the Beatles was released in Great Britain. The grim atmosphere engrossing the nation at the time, or so it's thought, left an opening for something upbeat and exciting to lift its spirits. It became the spark of a cultural shift, carrying a message of youth, energy, and hope that resonated far beyond Britain, and would ignite a phenomenon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Thank you for watching our documentary. If you liked it and want to see more, click the like button and comment below what your favorite track from With the Beatles is and what album we should do next. Also, consider joining our member program. For only $1.99, you can access exclusive perks like members-only videos, polls, and more. A huge thank you to all our members for making this all possible. That's all we have for you today, and I'll see you next time.